All right, we'll give this a go here.
All right, everybody. A little bit of a technical difficulty to start out with, but we'll be just fine. Appreciate everybody coming out again tonight. This is session 1000 of our 60-hour refresher course. Actually, I think it's kind of going fast. Tonight, we're going to have a good friend of mine, Captain Bill Opsitnik from Liberty Township Fire Department, talk to us about field triage, disasters, and MCIs, also ambulance safety. I have honestly personally worked mass casualty incidents with Captain Opsitnik with him in charge, and I thought we did a pretty darn good job. So I'm looking forward to that. After that, we're going to have Justin Koper. We've had him here before. Talk to us about the culture of safety in EMS. And then Dan Batsie is going to talk to us about crew resource management. These guys are all well versed in what they're going to be talking to us in today. I appreciate their time. Everybody who's teaching and everything else that is involved with this program is a voluntary basis, and I appreciate everybody sharing their talents with us. So, Captain Opsitnik, take it away, my friend.
All right, good evening, everybody. Talking about we're going to get underway first, talking about safe ambulance operations, and then we'll transition into MCI, mass casualty stuff. So obviously this time of year, talking about safe ambulance operations, icy roads, bad weather conditions, no kidding, right? Ambulances have gotten bigger. You know, when I started, it were the vans. I mean, obviously the folks before me were dealing with the hearses and stuff like that. But as the ambulances have gotten bigger, you know, the acceleration has been poor. They're less responsive, greater braking distance, and again, add in icy Ohio road conditions, and it's a recipe for disaster. And again, they're not your personal vehicles. They're a lot taller. The center of gravity is different. And again, it's always a bad day when the rubber's in the air instead of on the road. So the game plan is obviously paying attention to what you're doing. You know, when you're behind the wheel, there's always a lot of things going on that, you know, you're responding to the emergency, and if you don't get there, you can't help. And not only do you put the patient that we're responding to in danger, but you and your partners in the vehicle are in the same boat. That you know, we need to stay in control of our vehicles at all times. There we go. And again, even though we talk about bad weather playing a role, one of the things that we see this time of year is the slippy slides, right? We're coming up to an intersection, and that's always one of our most dangerous places to operate. Again, 3/4 of our accidents occur at intersections, but take into consideration that maybe driving too fast for conditions or not recognizing the slip in the road. But a lot of times, you know, just during daylight hours, we're out there and our collisions take place. Right angles or laterally, you know, our intersections just are such a dangerous spot for us. And again, our blind intersections, you know, as we're approaching those intersections, we need to be slowing down. We have you know, our lights and sirens sounding, that driver's got two hands on the wheel paying attention to what's going on. If you have somebody riding up front with you, you're both looking. You come to the intersection, complete stop, make sure nothing's moving, eye contact with some of the other drivers, and then accelerate through. And again, in this day and age with distracted drivers, people paying attention, you know, texting, driving, whatever, impaired drivers that are whatever substance of the day that they've got on board, that it's gotten a lot more dangerous for us. And again, emergency response, we have to be able to get there safely to be able to do any good. And again, one of the things we look at, how do we improve that safety for ourselves and for the public? Obviously, education. Making sure that the people that are operating the apparatus are, one, trained to do so, and two, licensed to do so. And not just by having, you know, a little bit of in-service training. You know, the every year driving to the parking lot and doing the cone avoidance drills isn't always necessarily your best bet, but again, you got to start somewhere. But having understanding of the vehicle, spending time with the vehicle, not just driving for emergencies, but also getting to know the vehicle so that you feel like you're in control of it, as opposed to riding the flaming Ferris wheel going down the road and just hoping for the best. Again, that's not a very good plan. That we want to be able to get to where we're going in a safe manner to do our job, and then get our patient to the next destination. So our hands-on driver training, and again, it almost seems that we need more training than we ever have time to do. And again, you work for a busy service, trying to find time to do that kind of training is a challenge at best. I remember a gentleman from Cleveland EMS talking about when they first started their business. It was a battalion chief, I think his name was Clarence Moore, but talked about when they first started the ambulance service in Cleveland, they had some minimally trained personnel. They put them in, I forget how many ambulances they had, and within a few weeks, every single one of the ambulance was wrecked because of lack of driver's training. So that obviously plays a role in what happens with us. So again, making sure that prior to any emergency responses that our people are qualified to be behind the wheel, that the day they report to work, that they are able to safely operate the ambulance. And again, some of the other things that we need to do, what is another big issue for us? Backing up, making sure that we can use our cameras, for a new technology, but our mirrors, being able to have a backer if we don't have a camera available to us. And again, becoming comfortable backing up, that seems to be a huge deal for us. I see a lot of times anymore that there are folks out there that when they pull into a driveway, and again, not every department's policy is to get into a driveway, and you can't always do that. But in some of the places that I'm most familiar with, we have the ability to get in the driveways. We have the ambulances that aren't too large, so we can able to do that. But being able to back in as opposed to pulling in those first. And again, the whole idea that if we are able to get our patient loaded and head out, backing in gives us a lot of opportunity to better serve. But again, we have to be comfortable. You don't want to back your ambulance into the ditch, or this time of year into the snowbank, and now you're stuck and you can't do nothing. So being very familiar and very comfortable with the vehicle that you're in, taking the time to make sure that the vehicle is ready to go at the start of your tour, and being prepared is going to do a lot for us. So again, our training and some of the training out there, the Ohio Fire Marshal has a driving simulator that I have not had a chance to do myself, but I'm looking forward to the opportunity here in the not so distant future that any type of training that obviously outside of on-the-job training is going to be very beneficial for us. Knowing where you're going. And again, sometimes we get very reliant on our being able to Google it or use our whatever app that we have to assist us as far as mapping goes. But knowing where you're going is a big deal. And again, being in this for a little while, back in the day, you were expected to be able to read a map, and there was nothing more disconcerting than somebody spinning that map like it was a pinwheel, that trying to find which direction they were heading. And again, but knowing your areas, that have a primary route, and what happens if that way's blocked. Knowing what your plan B is, that you can't always go down Market Street. You may have to take another side street to be able to get where you're going, is an important part. And again, which hospital is it? How do you get to the hospital? When I first started, again, when Liberty first went paramedic, and we had a lot of brand new people to us, the rule of thumb on whether or not who was driving and who was going to be in the back with the patient was, can you tell me how to get to the hospital? And if they weren't able to do so, then obviously the other person would drive in. That isn't always the best way of doing, but again, sometimes situations present. But in the meantime, knowing how to get to the hospital, having multiple ways around that based on weather or traffic or whatever, that you have a good understanding of where you want to go. And again, understanding the laws of the road. In Ohio, we have the due regard. We are asking the other drivers to share the road with us. us driving in an aggressive manner, our intent is not to force other drivers off the road. Our intent is to allow them to see us and make that decision to get out of the way and knowing the rules. And again, are we allowed to exceed the speed limit? Sure we are. But that doesn't mean that gives us the ability to make really bad decisions on small residential roads, where again, where we'd expect more people and things like that, where we have sudden surprises that we don't want a tragedy because we're driving too fast for conditions. Again, what are standing operating procedures set forth by our organization? And again, they should be best practices that realistically having standard operating procedures should almost be the same for wherever you go. What color t-shirt you're wearing doesn't really matter as far as how you operate the ambulance and things like that. And again, how are you qualified to be an operator? It shouldn't be just you show up to work and you appear sober and sane. Here's the keys, kid. That having the ability to make sure that you're able of sound mind and body and be able to operate the ambulance in a safe and effective manner. And what are the procedures for handling and reporting ambulance collisions? And again, sometimes for local government, that might mean instead of the local police department that we contact the state patrol. But again, what is the policy for that? We want to appear that we're being neutral with that we are not showing any type of favoritism by having the local Leos that might appear, even though we may be at fault, that there's the perception that there's something not fair going on. So having an outside agency, like I said, like the state patrol, can be very beneficial for us. Again, processes for investigating and reviewing each collision that occurs. Sometimes it's not always our fault. So there may be times that policy says that if this occurs, that there will be whatever type of discipline to go with it. But again, the investigation may show that the incident occurred. It may have been I made the decision that somebody pulled out in front of me, and my best course of action was to take this action. That yes, it did cause damage to the ambulance, but it was a lot less than if I would have been struck by that truck or whatever that would have possibly struck us, rolled us, and caused a lot more damage. So, and again, our quality assurance that after a collision, that what can we do to prevent this type of incident from occurring again? And again, what policies do we have to prevent? And it used to be the big one that always seemed to get us was our backing accidents, that they were always preventable. They occurred, and especially if you didn't use a backer, there was usually it was a violation of company policy. That realistically, how do you do that when you have a patient in the back and your partner driving up front, that without a camera, that your partner's supposed to look out the window, but if they're actively involved in patient care, what do you do? Sometimes you just had to hope for the best, and hopefully through training experience you avoided a disaster. But having a quality assurance program to go as a learning process is not always disciplinary, but a way to show that, all right, so we find that if we use this action, we prevent further tragedy, and that's kind of what we're looking for here. So again, like I mentioned, using a spotter when backing, seatbelts in an ambulance, especially up front. Obviously, there's times when we're doing patient care in the back that we may not always be able to be belted in, and we may not be always able to provide all of our treatment, and then our patient strapped in on the cot and we strap ourselves in, that we may have to do definitive care on the way where we don't have a means of securing ourselves. And again, when you're working in the back, that communication with your partner, whoever's driving the apparatus, little things, when you're making turns, if something jumps out in front of you, or somebody spikes the brakes in front of you, that communication from back to front, or front to back, saying that left turn, right turn, stop, brakes or whatever. And the same partners in the back treating the patient, and they're getting ready to start a line. I'm getting ready to stick. Goes a long way to if we can find some smooth road and try to help each other out. So our seatbelts, again, for our passengers as well. Some of the ambulances out there have the child seats. Putting our kids in, our patients that we don't really want mom just holding on to the infant, having better options available to us. Again, we started looking at how should we respond? Again, does every call justify lights and sirens? No, it doesn't, and everybody's in agreement with that. And again, there's even an argument that running lights and siren is kind of a bygone thing. That the time that it saves, the aggravation that it, the frustration that can go with, again, especially when dealing with inattentive drivers and things like that. And I'm not saying we should or shouldn't continue to use lights and sirens, but again, there's a level of understanding that, to a certain level, there's times it doesn't always help us out. In fact, can aggravate the situation. So again, use of a spotter, which again, day and age, we have cameras in the back of the ambulance, which can help, but having a backer is a good deal. So some of our other guidelines, how fast do we drive? Again, as fast as it goes isn't always a good plan. But again, what is the formal policy? And again, what happens if we break the policy? And things like that. What are we looking to do? That again, the idea we still have to be able to arrive. And just because we are legally allowed to exceed the speed limit is based on conditions. Is that always necessarily the right thing to do? Using of escorts is something that we don't see a whole lot of. And again, what's the biggest problem with using escorts is that it confuses the public. That we're not parades. I think, me personally, I've only been involved with escorts a couple of times, and that was I was in a mobile intensive care unit, and we had a siren failure. So my partner requested law enforcement to escort us, since we had lights, but we did not have appropriate warning devices to continue the response. But again, escorts, multi-vehicle responses, public expects a single vehicle. So they pull over, they start to resume normal traffic, and then there's another vehicle, which increases our chances of another accident. So, and again, in this day and age, zero policy for any under influence of alcohol or drugs while on duty. And again, even within 8 hours of the start of your tour, that you should not be indulging in such things. Again, not our place to judge, but if you're impaired and you get in an accident, obviously you're increasing the liability for yourself and your organization as well. So, and again, we talked about due regard again, that we are held to a higher standard. And again, due regard, we are asking the other drivers to assist us, and by sharing the road with us, and that should help us keep ourselves in a, we're asking the other drivers to share with us, and if they don't, we have to react to that. Again, increase our distance between the other vehicles, anticipate people just spiking the brakes and stopping right in front of us and not moving out of the way for us. So we need to be in a position that our due regard is if they choose not to share, that we have to anticipate and move with. And again, there may be times that, based on traffic conditions, that we are unable to move. And we may have to call additional resources or go from there. So our due regard standard, again, our posted speed limits, again, we do have the ability in the state of Ohio to exceed, but we have to be able to stay in control of our vehicles. And again, the justification for it. 25 miles an hour doesn't mean that we should be coming down that street at 60 miles an hour. Our posted direction to travel, again, when you go against traffic on a one-way street, yes, we can legally do so, but the reaction from the other drivers is something we need to consider as well. Parking regulations, requirements to wait at red lights. And again, we come to a complete stop, make sure the intersection is clear, and then we proceed again with that due regard, that we hope the people choose to share the road with us, and if they do, that's great, and if they don't, we have to make the adjustments. Again, we may have to wait until traffic stops and we're able to maneuver our way around. So some of the things that no matter what happens, even if we are responding emergency, that school buses with the red flashing lights, again, that is a stop sign with children involved, that us coming to a complete stop, even with lights and sirens. Now, me personally, if I have a school bus and I'm responding on the red, that if the lights are on, when I come to a complete stop, I'll turn the siren off, because more than likely there's a child close by. So that, we don't always know what that child's going to do. So always better not to wait till the bus driver has control of the child, or the child has gotten out of the roadway, and we get the signal from the bus driver when they turn the lights off. Railroad crossings with the gates down, again, that's a suicide mission. Those gates go down, we stop, we wait for the train to go by. There's no real other way to operate with that. And again, having worked in an agency where we had a very heavy train traffic, that you just advise dispatch, we've been caught by a train, and when you're backing around, you let them go. So if there's ever a complaint about an extended response, there's not much we can do. Again, without an overpass or an underpass to get around the train tracks, that if that's our only way we can get, we may just have to wait out the train sometimes. So again, the due regard as far as the responsibility for deciding when and where exemptions apply for drivers. Again, the state laws will back that up. And we're always going to be held to a higher standard, because again, we're supposed to be higher trained, and as a level of professionalism that we are expected to act in a higher level. And again, we should be attentive and prepared to shoulder responsibilities that come with that. So again, if you're not willing to accept those responsibilities, then maybe you shouldn't drive. And again, without understanding that some people will blow it off like it's not that big of a deal, but it is. There's a lot of responsibility there that, again, we are expected, always held to a higher standard. We are expected to do our job. So again, lights and sirens, that false sense of security. We can't always rely on that people are paying attention to what we're doing. And one of the things that, especially in a urban environment where the motorists would be less inclined to yield to when the siren is sounding continuously, again, there's nowhere for the noise to go, there's nowhere for them to go, and they just kind of give up. Sometimes, and around us, there's times that, even based on heavy conditions, and again, I've had experience with this on the interstate, on Interstate 80, State Route 11, when traffic is completely backed up and there's nowhere for people to go. Blasting them with the air horn in the queue and the electric siren and stuff like that isn't going to make them move anymore. They've already moved as fast as they can, or to the most that they can, and we may have to maneuver ourselves, or we may have to just kind of stop and call somebody else and try to hope for the best. People were able to figure it out a little bit and move for us, because again, sometimes there's nowhere to go. You get run out of concrete and all you have is soft shoulder or median. You don't want to roll your vehicle or get stuck or whatever, that you may not be able to get through immediately. So you may have to consider additional resources coming from an alternate direction to try to get there. So, and again, some people think that we abuse the right-of-way privileges when the sirens are sounded. Again, that's something that a lot of the places I worked for over the years, that if you use lights and sirens that weren't for an emergency, there was disciplinary action that was sometimes severe. And I always inclined to agree with that. Again, that due regard, we're asking for the citizens to share the road with us, and we don't want to use it because, we didn't feel like sitting in traffic anymore. So when we give them the ability for lights and sirens, or we choose to use it, we're giving the public, we're hoping the public will work with us and allow us to move out of the way for it. So it's something that we really need to consider. And one of the things that we tend to see, again, that with that false sense of security, that inexperienced motorists tend to increase driving speeds by 10 to 15 miles an hour when the siren is sounded. And again, one of the things that we see the people in the back of the ambulance, they start questioning, boy, am I really that bad that they're using the sirens and the lights to get me to where I'm going? And again, there's times that, realistically, how much time do we actually save with our patient, that if we go with traffic and we give a sense of calm and, again, professionalism to our patients, that, how come you guys aren't running lights and sirens? Well, we feel that your condition's stable enough that we can do what we need to do. And it's not a lot of the patient that if they turn the lights and sirens are on, and now they start believing, oh my goodness, it is that bad. I can't believe I must really be in bad shape. That the level of anxiety can make things worse. And again, our goal isn't to make it worse. We're trying to leave things better than what we found them, and get them to the hospital in better shape than what we were initially dealt with. So again, one of the things that we may see from long-term running red, that anxiety and hearing problems. I can tell you that. I mean, me personally, I will tell you, I've got a touch of the tinnitus from years of exposure to loud noises in this business. After 33 years, I get it. I can't hear as well as I used to. So we're using our sirens. Again, intersections, really good idea. There's nobody around. Do we really need lights and sirens on at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody's there? Bambi doesn't care what the lights are on or off. Who are we warning outside of waking everybody up? Just because we're up, they'll be up. Maybe not the best answer. Again, if you don't need your lights and sirens to get through an intersection or go against traffic, you really need to have them on at all. So, and never assume people are going to hear the siren. Again, as cars have become more and more soundproof, that some of our best noises, whether it be air horns or the mechanical cue sirens or the warblers or the rumblers or whatever they are they really effective? I don't know. Sometimes they seem like they really work well. Sometimes they don't. Then you get the poor person on the motorcycle that's getting blasted by the cue and the air horn, and what are you doing? And the person in the Mercedes right next door doesn't hear anything. So we have to assume that they're not hearing us, that they don't see us, and we just have to keep good following distances, keep control of the ambulance. And again, one of the old school tips that I was taught when I first got into this business was not whipping the siren up and down, making all the fancy noises. You had two hands on the wheel. If you hit the horn button on the steering wheel, it would change the tone from wail to yell. And that was all you really needed. In fact, the phaser sirens and the electric air horns a lot of times made it sound like the sirens were cutting out, that there really wasn't a noise. And although it was really rewarding for somebody to whip the knob on the siren making all kinds of fancy noises, practical application was they really weren't doing much. So, that due regard, not trying to get up on people, keeping a good space between yourselves, be able to react to what's going on. Seemed like it always did a lot more. And again, some people are going to ignore it. Some people are going to speed up. They're not always going to. Due regard means we're going to share, and not everybody learned the lessons from kindergarten and chose to share with us. Okay, and again, be prepared for panic and erratic maneuvers when people do see the lights and sirens. Spike the brakes right in the middle. We want the public to go to the right for sirens and lights. What do? Everything but. They may go left, they may stop, they may go sideways. So anticipate, again, keeping that good following distance with the vehicle in front of you, so that when they do make a poor choice, that we don't make a worse choice by smacking into the back of them. That having that distance in between us, that we allow ourselves to be able to remain in control of the vehicles. When we go through an intersection, foot covering the brake, so that if we have to make an emergency maneuver, we're able to. And again, contrary to Mother Jugs and Speeds, the reference to using the sirens to scare the nuns in the crosswalk, we don't use sirens to scare anyone. And again, it really doesn't solve anything. As much fun as to hit the air horn at your partner when they come out of the Dairy Mart with a squishy in their hand, that really doesn't do any good for anybody. So don't use sirens to scare each other. Again, it's always been a good practice to leave your headlights on day or night, emergency lights on or off. That again, the white lights provide better visibility. And the corners of the ambulance should have large flashers that blink in tandem or unison, that helps oncoming vehicles identify location and size of the ambulance. So, and one of the things that we have found, studies have found, if you'll notice, law enforcement uses blue lights. And again, that's not just to separate difference between law enforcement and fire and EMS, but they found that the orange and red lights actually draw impaired and tired drivers, whereas the blue is a better and provides better visibility. However, again, tradition being what it is, that fire and EMS tend to always have the red lights with a little bit of orange on the back, whereas law enforcement was red or blue, and although we're seeing more and more law enforcement go to blue lights. So, again, one of the things that comes down to that the visibility, vehicle clearly visible from 360 degrees, so that as we're approaching an intersection, as we go through the intersection, as we clear the intersection, that we are able to be seen. And again, like I mentioned before, the benefits afforded patients by lights and siren response are not offset to the risks of the crew and the public, just because we don't necessarily always have to have our lights and sirens on. Like I mentioned before, the escorts and multiple vehicle responses. I've outside of a mechanical issue with a siren, it really doesn't do us any good to have law enforcement with us. And again, the braking differences and the acceleration speeds that we may create gaps where people start, again, like I mentioned earlier, pulling back into traffic, and actually makes it more dangerous for responders. And again, one of the things, especially with the intersection, and the intersection is our most dangerous spot. So, and I'll appreciate the intersection, assuming you may meet another emergency vehicle. A lot of you have probably seen a few years ago the video from one of the major metropolitan cities where the two ladder trucks came into the intersection and collided. One of them rolled over, and fortunately nobody was killed, but there have been a large number of people in our business killed by responding vehicles meeting up in intersections because nobody stopped to make sure that the intersection was clear. Red lights were ran. Excessive speed was always a factor. And unfortunately, again, we may have our own people hurt or killed, damage to the apparatus, and the people that originally needed our help are left with significant delays because now a significant part of their response that was coming for them is unable to respond because of some poor choices. And again, our parking and loading of the ambulance, our scene size up for potential hazards for our crew and our patients. Again, our setting up our danger zone at least 100 feet from the wreckage, upwind and uphill, and any puddles as well. So again, if the vehicle starts to leak, if it catches fire, then we're able to be clear of it. If we don't have any leaks, we can get a little bit closer. If we have personnel available directing traffic, that's not always the case. Park in front of the wreckage, so warning lights can alert approaching vehicles. Again, one of the things with that, if you're going to stop oncoming traffic, me personally, I always try to make sure that the back of my ambulance is facing the shoulder. So not to be in line, and my wheels are turned away from the incident, so that if we do get struck, that our ambulance doesn't go plunging into the initial incident, but loading away from oncoming traffic. So towards the shoulder gives us the safest spot to be able to get our patient loaded away from traffic. And again, if we have to use our ambulance to block traffic, understand that there's not a lot of girth behind that. It's not going to stop a whole lot. It's more, having dump trucks, if they're available, become very popular. Having ODOT with enough time, having fire apparatus. And again, some communities will take their ladder trucks up to block multi-lanes. And that's a huge thing. Again, that buffer for us. Unfortunately, because of distracted drivers, whether it be from texting or substance abuse, has turned into our biggest liability. So the things that we can do to block oncoming traffic coming at us is a big deal. And understand that even when we try to block traffic, the public is still going to try to get through it, because that means the perception, it seems like it's for everybody else but me. And we may have cars that try to sneak through or try to get around, and all of a sudden we thought we had safe space, and there's somebody coming barreling down on us. So we need to be very much alert of that. Yeah, setting up flares and cones and things like that. And again, other drivers, heads on a swivel. And a lot of experience working on Interstate 80 and Interstate Route 11. That it doesn't take much for traffic to back up, and man, once traffic starts rolling again, it's rolling. So, and those, the big trucks don't stop on a dime. Everybody's rubbernecking. A lot of bad things can happen. So, when we're operating on those scenes, having buffer space, calling for on major, state routes, consider ODOT early to get them out with the directional arrows, and it's going to be a long time. Get them out. A couple years ago in the construction on Interstate 80, when we were putting the third lane in, there was the truck 403 that had a directional arrow on the top of it, and they were a cell phone away that they were able to get out fairly early to start helping reroute traffic, which was huge for us. And unfortunately, because of the numbers of troopers that have been impacted over the years, the state patrols have been a lot more receptive to blocking roads and stopping traffic and things like that. Obviously, trying to play along with each other, and if we can let some traffic go through or reroute as best we can, it is noticed and appreciated, and that's part of being part of the team. But again, if we can't do that, if it's going to compromise patient and crew safety, road stays closed. Again, as long as there are injuries on scene, the fire chief is designated in the state of Ohio is in charge of the incident. And even though there may be some pressure sometimes you gotta stand your ground, and you're doing it in the safety of your personnel. You may not get Christmas cards, but you're going to do what's right by your people. So again, blocking oncoming traffic, we're going to kind of bounce past that there. And again, sometimes, like I mentioned, if we can keep the back of the ambulance away from oncoming traffic towards the shoulder. Some of our warning lights may be blocked by the doors being open, so we have to be wary of that. And again, if we have another vehicle, whether it's law enforcement, fire apparatus, or whatever, to create more of a safe buffer space for us, by all means. Again, like I mentioned earlier, the red revolving lights attack drunks or tired drivers. And again, using our amber, our rear seal blinker lights that flash in tandem or in unison. So our deadly intersection, again, places that come into a complete stop, making sure that everything around us has gone by. Crashing through an intersection is just a recipe for disaster. Even going through to slow speed, you never know what people are going to do. Coming to a complete stop, making sure everybody's going, that they're stopping, and again, making eye contact with people. Again, people make rash decisions. They're not even paying attention. Making that eye contact, make them realize to slow down. But again, at night, that's going to be a lot more of a challenge. So our lights and sirens, again, we are only asking for, and we are using our lights to warn people. But again, not the end all be all. And again, don't always assume that the public's going to know what you're going to do. If you're going to make turns, use your turn signals. Okay. Again, we try to go to the left to go around vehicles. That's sometimes easier said than done. If you're dealing with a boulevard where you have a median in the middle, I'll give you an example: Belmont Avenue, for anybody that cruises up through Liberty, that we try to go left, and there's a boulevard marker right there that we have to now go into oncoming traffic to be able to come around. And again, once you come in, you're coming head on at people. You're hoping that they're going to go right, and hopefully they do that. So, and again, people may try to pull to the right lane just as you attempt to pass. So again, paying attention to what's going on, heading the game, as many eyes down the road as we possibly can to make this as safe as possible for ourselves. Again, how long does it take to get the ambulance across the intersection? How long is the vehicle? Obviously, the bigger the ride, the longer it takes. Watch for pedestrians. And again, they come popping out of everywhere. And whether or not they're paying attention, they have their earbuds in, or just not, that pedestrians have the right of way. And they may just scoot out in front of you. And you need to recognize that at intersections or anywhere, that people can pop out of nowhere. And again, we don't really, that rolling stop, we want to come to a complete stop with our vehicles, that, how much our vehicles weigh. Medium duty vehicles, 24,000 pounds. Fire apparatus or even more than that. And trying to get stopped and stay in control of the vehicle is a big deal. So as we wrap up with ambulance safety, again, the big things I want to touch on. Again, drive ahead. keeping a safety buffer, a good safe distance between you. Again, in our personal vehicles, the rule of thumb used to always be to see, when you're stopped, see concrete in front of you. When you're in an emergency vehicle, I say even more than that, because again, if you're sitting at an intersection and you're dispatched to a run, you flip on your lights and sirens, where's that car in front of you going to go when you're right up on their bumper? Keep a space between you. Again, be a good example. Keep, when you're responding, keep a buffer in front of you. If the car in front of you isn't slowing down or not getting over, keep a distance between you so that if they do finally see you or make a move, that you aren't caught off guard by what happens. Position your apparatus for success, and again, keep yourselves out of oncoming traffic as best you can. Due regard, we are asking to share the road, and hopefully they do. And again, we have to anticipate that people are not always going to pay attention, and they aren't always going to be willing to share. So that wraps up ambulance operations. I'm going to need a second here to pull up my next slides for mass casualty. Before I do so, are there any questions on anything? If not, I'm going to go quiet.
John Capt has his hand up.
No.
What's that?
No.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there's any, what are the best guidelines you've seen actually put pen to paper to provide guidance to EMTs and paramedics on when to run hot response or emergency response is for your transport to the hospital?
That's actually a great question. As far as that goes, I almost hate to defer, but it's something that you should almost think about as far as I've not really seen anything with that. It's always been kind of come down to the crew choice and company policy. But there is an argument that there should maybe stuff out there that what is our justification for the decision to run red? We see some places that are doing EMD dispatching that will either upgrade or downgrade a response, but there's nothing. No recognized standard that I'm aware of that's actually a great topic of conversation that maybe individual organizations need to take a look at what they should do. And unfortunately, that's I'm not trying to pass the buck on that, but I've not seen one. Some places have gone. I'll tell you my own organization when I started, the policy was every trip to the hospital, you went to the scene lights and sirens, you went to the hospital lights and sirens, and that was just how it was. And then as we became more educated, and especially coming from other agencies, and went, why are we doing this? That that has changed dramatically, and I still think that there's a lot of room for improvement yet myself.
All right, thank you very much.
All right. Give me 1 second here as I bring up my next slide. And hold on 1 sec.
Hey, Bill, this is Nick Graff. To help answer John's question, at least as far as the state is concerned, the state just says a true emergency. So if you're having a true emergency, you're allowed to run lights and sirens. And the breakdown of that as I understand it, is if life or limb is at peril. And that's kind of how the state leaves it up. So if you can make a reasonable argument to say that somebody's life or limb was at peril, you're allowed to run lights and sirens. That's the state. Every department then could break it down even more.
Sure. No, good stuff, Nick. Thank you.
While Bill's getting set up, one of the things that is in our protocol for our stroke protocol is that any stroke or suspected stroke, that is a true emergency and should be run with lights and sirens to the hospital. Yeah, regardless of the time window, because we're learning more and more about strokes and the amount of time we have to treat them. But as always, time is tissue, so that's one of our big things.
This is John Cameron, and I think some of the discrepancy I've seen is, you have a chest pain patient, not necessarily an obvious STEMI, but in distress. Is that a threat to life or limb? And I think, I've seen some departments start to put a little bit more stricter, review on when someone is transporting lights and sirens and when they are not. But, it's obviously pretty hard to define.
Yeah, lights and sirens should not be a substitute for good patient care. Like, if you don't know what to do, you shouldn't just run lights and sirens. So I agree with that too. You should be able to manage the patient, think methodically, and then if it's a STEMI, a heart attack, a STEMI, a stroke, or a trauma, or anything of the like, then you definitely need to run red.
All right, so I think we're ready to go here. Am I back? My screen back up?
Your camera is up, but your screen is not.
All right. Nobody wants to see that mug. Wow.
Hey, Brandy Hess, you have your camera on. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. Thank you. Looks like it's loading here, Bill.
Okay. Oops, wrong one. Hold on. There we go. Okay, how we doing?
Nothing yet, just you.
Just me? Oh boy. Okay, how we doing?
Nothing yet.
It's still me, huh? All right. I think I am hitting the share screen, but something is not working. All right, I'm going to X out and start fresh. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Am I making any progress here?
All right, we're almost close to the hour, so why don't everybody take an 8-minute break? We'll get with Bill, and then we'll come back at 7 o'clock, and then we'll be ready to go. So if you could put your hands up, I'll get with Bill, we'll get things ready, and we'll come back at 8 o'clock. I'm sorry, 7 o'clock, 8 minutes.
Yeah, I see me too.
Bill, what's coming up now?
Yeah, with some expert behind the scenes technical advisory, crisis has been averted.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. Don't pay attention to the guy on the screen either. He's not doing a real good job himself.
I laughed at the anxiety you get when the guy next to you keeps spinning the map around.
Oh, been there, done that, man. Then that's done. That just suck. You're like, what are you doing? It ain't a pinwheel. I mean, I'll give you one spin to go from north to south. And again, that used to be a big deal. You know, I mean, back teaching map reading classes to people, you know, the top of the page is always north. I'll give you one complimentary spin to turn it upside down to go south. But after that, oh man.
Yeah. Larry was just saying that when he was at AMR, Paul Elia, that was his rule, one spin.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. I mean, that was, like I said, I remember working with people who never knew where they were going, and they were actually told, instead of finding it on the map, just pick a direction and you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
That got to be pretty exciting too.
Not everybody had a Fred Stozic.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you what though, man, when you had somebody like Fred, or work in the city with Chief Barry Finley back in the day, that knew the city.
Yep.
And I mean, my goodness, working with, and I'll say, Colleen Major, Kelly Nyers, when I first started, Mark D'Angelo, that knew the city. I mean, it was, fantastic. And when you actually, when somebody's like, oh, you probably need to look that one up. I'm not sure myself. That got to be pretty exciting. So, but yeah.
Maybe they need to have another class on learning the city, reading maps versus this GPS stuff.
Well, I don't disagree. And it's one of the things that, I don't know, it became habit with me. Every time I go to work somewhere new, I try to get on the road and drive around, and not only because it's always more fun to be in the buggy than it is in quarters, but you learn stuff. And again, you find landmarks that are familiar. You learn, traffic patterns are, and all those good things that you just don't learn, at the time. I mean, granted, GPS, and when it can tell you about traffic backing up and stuff like that, is fantastic. I mean, even the technology on that's improved. But I still say, knowing your area, you can't put a price tag on that. You shouldn't have to be completely relying on electronic device that could fail. Especially when you're working for an agency that is responsible for, one township or a part of a township, a district or whatever, that, you're supposed to have the corporate knowledge of that community, and you have that expectation that you're going to get it done. So.
That is true. Some of us old people, we learn from reading the maps, and we learn the quadrants of the city and all the roads.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I even, the between the northwest and the northeast and the southwest, there were streets that had, the same name with the same numbers, but it was that northeast or southwest that made the difference. And it wasn't you suffering when you went to the wrong one. It was the person who we were supposed to be taking care of.
Oh yeah, and 100 on Southwest ain't nowhere near 100 on Northeast or whatever. That's for sure.
Affirm.
I agree.
All right,
There's
it's
something.
7 o'clock.
There's something to be said too about knowing your area doesn't get you. I mean, I haven't been working Youngstown for almost 20 years, and I can still zip around Youngstown because Nyers and all them made me learn without the GPS.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, half the fun was cruising the city to see what was going on. It was worth the price of admission. Cruising the back streets. That's where you found out what was really happening in the city. Cruising Market Street was fun, but you go Oak Hill or rolling up Andrews Avenue. Sometimes it was a good time seeing what was going on. So, anyway, all right, let's get back to business here. Getting into the challenge of the multi-casualty incidents. And again, dealing with the mass casualty, it doesn't take much. You get 4 people in a vehicle that smashes into a minivan that's got 8 people in there. You got 12 patients to sort out. You got 2 ambulances coming. How do you figure out who needs what's the appropriate resources? And again, once we start making that determination that we need additional resources, one of the challenges has been that the lack of EMS command in the field, that you have the crew showing up, and by default, it was usually the paramedic, or if there was a double medic car, whose turn it was in the back was the one that was going to be in charge, and the other person was doing triage. as far as figuring out, how many more ambulance do we need? Could we take 2? Or the uncharted territory of mom and her 3 kids that are all, I want them looked at, but there's really nothing going on with them. Do we shove mom and all 3 kids in the back of one squad and go? I mean, been there myself. Sometimes yep, sometimes no. It all depends on the circumstances. But again, some of the things that we look at, that adequate widespread notification of the event, that if we have a true mass casualty incident, that we may not be taking all of our patients to St. E's, Maine, that we might have to spread out, that we may be taking, might even be taking adults to Akron Kids and Boardman, just because we have some, low acuity patients that we could send there. That we might be from Youngstown taking patients to Warren without blinking an eye, out to Austintown to the standalone ER for the stuff that doesn't require admission. You might be going to Salem or Sharon or over to Hermitage, based on how many resources you're going to need, in addition to bringing in their medical, depending on circumstances. So, and we start looking at doing a good job of our initial proper triage, and the lack of rapid initial stabilization of patients. And again, one of the things that I look at and I think of a lot was that shooting in Las Vegas a couple years ago. That, yeah, there were people, obviously a lot of people died from that. I don't remember the numbers, but what stuck with me, I remember reading an article about it. And it's something that has popped up time and time again with mass casualty, is what's known as the breakout. And the breakout is the people that don't stay in the perimeter of the incident. They get out, whether they're hurt or not. They get to their vehicles. They either take themselves to the hospital themselves, or they go home first, or they go somewhere other than where the incident happened. And now those calls are coming in for additional strain on the system. And again, that breakout, that anticipation of people just doing whatever. Years ago, I was part of when the Beaver Valley Nuclear Facility did their annual drills, and they talked about setting up mass decon areas on a couple locations, one being the Nagley Fire Department and one being Beaver Local High School. Well, the question always came to be, how are you going to get everybody that's bouncing out of there to hit those 2 spots that are coming west? And what do you do with the people that slip through the cracks and then turn around and call and find out that they've been contaminated? And you get an ambulance crew that gets called for flu-like symptoms, and they're going to roll up thinking that, flu-like symptoms, and here it's some radioactive emergency that, and now the crew is put in jeopardy because of that. And that breakout is a big deal. And I think about that a lot with the Ohio Stadium, down at Ohio State, the Horseshoe. If you've ever walked the Horseshoe and take a look, all of the fire hydrants have a single steamer discharge on the end of them. But if you look even closer than that, there's holes drilled in them. And the holes are drilled in them for a mass decon that all the fire department would have to do is open up the fire hydrants, and it would create a water mist to effectively hose down everybody coming out of the stadium. So if they had to decon everybody, there's no escaping it. There's no breakout. You're not getting out of that place without getting hosed down. And again, that's some pretty forward thinking. So that kind of leads us into our next part of this journey here, as far as the multi-casualty incident, and as far as some of the things that we. If it's going to let me change screens. Okay. So one of the things that we look at, what is some of our biggest problems? Again, failure to set up initial triage, setting up treatment areas based on the resources needed, overly time-consuming patient care. And again, when you're dealing with a lot of sick or injured people at one time, we don't have the luxury that we normally do for our long-term assessment. that might take several minutes. Ideally, our initial assessment in a mass casualty incident should be about 30 seconds. So our premature transportation of patients, again, people getting loaded up in personal vehicles, people just grabbing people and running with them, grabbing law enforcement, throwing people in the back of cruisers and rolling in. And again, like the city of Philadelphia, that is a standard practice. They come across somebody, a trauma patient, gunshot, stab wound, things like that, that they actually have parking at the 4 level 1 trauma centers in downtown Philadelphia for the cruisers to come rolling up with somebody. And again, if we're trying to figure out who was part of this incident to get the right resources, and people are squirting out the side because we don't have scene control, that can be a challenge for us. And again, how do we get scene control? Trying to secure the perimeter with law enforcement, with fire, trying to get, bystanders, anybody we can to help get a handle on this. And again, that improper, inefficient use of field personnel, trying to get the most help to the right people. And again, setting improper distribution of patients in medical facilities. Yes, St. E's might be the only level 1 trauma center close by, but can the patients we're sending, can they do fine with a level 3 trauma center? Or are we able to get helicopters to take patients to other level 1 trauma centers? And again, these are things that we need to figure out ahead of time, that an annual mass casualty drill is useful, but if the information isn't acted upon and improvements made, then it's more of an exercise in futility, unfortunately. And again, tracking our patients. And I bring that up about the mass casualty drills. Years ago, I took part in one where they had patients set up and they were triaged out, and we were a later arriving unit. And one of our patients that we got, we should have been to the point that we were at best taking low acuity patients in to wrap up the exercise. And here there was a patient that had been classified as red and had been left and been skipped over and was laying on a backboard for an hour. And literally we stopped the exercise once we got the patient, the guy in the back of the ambulance, because he actually was admitting that he'd been on the backboard for so long that he actually had real life back pain. So, and that was a drill where it didn't matter, but let alone on an emergency incident where we're now determining which patients need to go where. And if we're not tracking our patients appropriately, how do we know where they went? What's our follow-up? What happened to them? Did they, was our initial classification correct? Did the patient that was originally maybe a red, which is a high acuity patient, because we didn't have enough resources initially, that patient died. And again, we'll get to the classification with that here shortly. But again, making sure that we have the right tracking system, that we don't lose patients, that we can prevent deaths that should have been avoidable by properly tracking our patients. Again, another big issue that the Marks radios are hopefully going to be addressing, possibly, maybe, or allegedly, is being able to communicate with everybody. And that was always a big deal in the Youngstown area for mass casualties. That again, most commonly before the Marks radios, the HEAR radio channels were an option. That was something that most of us had. But again, that is now fallen by the wayside. So being able to have adequate communications goes a long way. And again, the vests don't make an incident, but vests do help coordinate activities. And especially on a large scale incident, that where are we taking our patients, who's in charge of stuff, who's tracking, and things like that are very important pieces of information for us. And again, one of the biggest problems that we have, lack of training or practice at mass casualty incidents. And again, most providers have, using that example of the minivan and the loaded car, and they're all relatively minor injuries. Again, we don't have any loss of consciousness, my neck, my back, my wallet, kind of things that are all lower acuity. It's just a matter of getting enough resources on scene. But add in somebody that has a flail segment, or somebody that has multiple long bone fractures that are now, in addition to all the folks that possibly a wrist ankle, an isolated ankle fracture, things like that, that trying to sort out who needs to go where and when is something we can easily figure out. But when you add on, when you have 20 people that have major life-threatening injuries that require a lot of resources, and then another 20 that, if not receiving care in a timely manner, are going to become life threats, and then also dealing with a large amount of walking wounded, and then if there are people that are dead as well. And again, we look at our local drills, that there's not a lot of participation, and that's not meant as a shot or a bad statement. It's the fact that it just really doesn't happen. And most of the stuff we do, we kind of do it on the fly. You know, every now and again, we may be involved in a local incident, a training exercise or things like that. But by and large, you know, it's kind of, we figure it out as we go, and hopefully that we, you know, don't under triage or over triage, but we get it right. And again, that community assessments, pre-planning, and contingency plans. Again, you know, when you have set hazards within your community, and again, you can't always prep for everything, but you know, is it realistic that if you have a major thoroughfare traveling through your community, that you could have a charter bus that's going to have 60 people on it that could end up on its side, and you're going to have a lot of hurt people in there? And what plans do you have? What is the plan to notify all the local hospitals as far as who's going, how many resources do you need, and as far as how many ambulances are available? I remember years ago being, the conventional wisdom was that you could handle any mass casualty incident with 10 ambulances. That the idea was that those 10 transporting units would very quickly take the patients to the receiving facilities. They would come back, and again, this all fell under the incident management system. That again, if you are, you know, once you're dispatched to an incident, you report into staging, you're given an assignment, and after that assignment is complete, then you are either dismissed or you return to staging for another assignment. And again, if agencies don't have a plan in place to deal with that, and going back into, you know, incident command, where you have an incident commander, you know, triage officer, and then setting up an EMS branch, a rescue branch, and a fire branch, and then also dealing with, obviously, law enforcement, or again, on a state highway, dealing with ODOT. If it's a railroad, dealing with whatever railroad agency that is, and setting up a unified command post. That again, a lot of these places, that if you're further down on the rank structure as a EMT or a paramedic, and you may not be involved much more than the initial triage, but that initial triage is going to be one of the most important parts of what we're going to do to get people sorted out in the right way. So, you know, that training, that pre-planning, recognizing hazards within your community and what actions need to be taken and what resources we need to supplement what we have. Because again, a mass casualty incident is very easily going to overwhelm all of our resources. You know, a big event is not going to take much. And again, how do we anticipate it? We're further ahead to think that our friend Murphy, you know, Murphy's Law is going to show up everywhere. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong, times 2. So, and again, the rule of thumb is if you have one, you need a second one, because 2 is 1. Because if you only have one, it's going to get broken or lost. So, again, anticipating problems. Anything that we can plan in advance. Again, which hospitals? How do we notify them? How do we, you know, use our dispatch center? Are we going to make those calls ourselves? Are we going to get the EMA involved to set up the emergency operations center for us to facilitate phone calls and things like that? What are we going to do? Again, recognizing problems. If we have a shooting in a school, you know, what is our plan to control the parents that are going to come there? How are we going to get the students out? How are we going to work with law enforcement to, in addition to under the, you know, the rescue task force, do we have people trained and equipped to be able to go into the warm zone like is being recommended? You know, again, if you don't have the gear, you need to stay out. But again, the longer we stay out, the more potential for further loss of life and limb, that if we had the right equipment in a timely manner, that we can get in and make a better deal. And again, the complete assessment of potential hazards, both natural and man-made. Again, we had in 1985 a very large tornado come through. We could have, although, you know, any type of terrorist event you think of, that again, we have major railway, major highway. We have the largest corridor of airplanes. That's why we have the highest population of FBI agents in this region, because of the number of commercial airlines that fly above us every day. So our little slice of heaven, there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. So having plans in place and you know, we'll wing it or hope for the best. You know, hope isn't a plan. Yeah, you got to have a more aggressive thought process as far as handling that. So again, some of the sites we look at, you know, chemical or nuclear plants, factories, mines, schools, jails, you know, sporting events, entertainment centers, railroads, airports. And again, ahead of time, having SOPs and protocols for potential incidents. I can't tell you which ones, you know, as far as you know, what takes precedent. And again, we have all of these right by us. Again, you know, in northeastern Ohio, the Perry nuclear plant up on Lake Erie, the Beaver Valley nuclear plant down in Midland, PA, both of them within 50 miles of us. So it's not that unrealistic that if something happened that we could be collateral damage, basically. And having plans in place, again, the EMA should be very beneficial as a resource, and working with local agencies to set that up. And hopefully there are those lines of communication. So again, what are contingency plans for worst case scenarios? You know, as far as where can we get extra help? What can we do? Again, state of Ohio, we have a wonderful state mutual aid system that we may not have, you don't have to have local contracts basically providing mutual aid with each other, that the state recognizes closest with the mostest. If you have a pre-plan, test it, you know, and it doesn't have to be, you know, tabletop it, you know, see what works, what doesn't work, is communication. See what happens. If you have a plan that works out the wrinkles, pass it out. And again, a plan is just so you have something you know you can deviate from, but you got to have something. You know, it's got to start somewhere. So, and again, you don't want the plan to be so specific that it turned into a cookie recipe where we're doing this. You know, step one is this, step two is this. That recognizing that we may need, depending on the incident, what do we need to get this going? You know, establishing command, setting up a command post, setting up a staging area where we can get our resources in, setting up our sectors as far as the incident goes, and then going from there. And make sure the people, you know, that are part of the incident management system. Again, locally, we just did the NIMS 3 and 400, which are all part of this. And again, all the forms that if it turned into an emergency, you know, have all the forms in place to be able to get, you know, not only more assistance from the state or federal government, but you know, the reimbursements as well. You know, participating in drills. And unfortunately, one of the things with drills that we kind of lose, and I go back to what I was talking about earlier, the breakout. You know, we do the mass casualty drills and everybody has their little tag and they lay on the ground and we walk up and we read the tag and we may talk about decon, or we may even decon a few people to make it look good, depending on if it's a chemical event. But, you know, practical application, you know, when we do a mass casualty drill, everything's nice and calm. We don't have, even if we have people moolaged up to get people's attention, in the grand scheme of things, you know, it's a lot different when it's for real. That, again, I mentioned breakout, and that's always been the big deal. A lot of people are going to try just to get out of there. You know, trying to corral people, like trying to herd cats. You know, they're not always going to want to do what you want them to do. So getting in position to secure the perimeter, so to speak, and again, using law enforcement to help do that. Make sure that we didn't miss anybody that was hiding or whatever. But, you know, the drills, they have their little tag on them. We go up and read the tag and go, oh, this injury is severe. They need to go first. And again, part of that is what happens, not only are we dealing with the public, but what happens when it's one of us. And one of the easiest ways to upset an incident is to have an emergency responder get hurt. That even though their injury may not be severe, it's going to be a distraction for everybody else. And one of us gets priority to get them out of there because now everybody can go back to doing their jobs. And that's a big part of. And I'll give you an example. Right before Northside shut down, might have been a year or two, they requested the fire department assist them with a mass casualty drill. And we went through and we read the injuries when we saw them. When we got, after we sorted out the 3 or 4 patients they gave us, we actually went back through and looked at a little closer. We read the injuries, but we didn't really look at who they were and actually how it was. There was supposedly a couple of firefighters that were involved out of the 6 people, I think, that were injured. And we actually told them, no, we kind of misidentified these people because the firefighters, even though one was severe and one was minor, would have gotten priority because it would have brought the incident to a screeching halt, and they would have been our first ones out. And it took a little bit of conversation with the staff, and they agreed with us all along. But again, that's something that we have to keep in mind. Our worst case scenario is during the event, some of us get hurt, and that now changes everything for us, and we have to adjust from there. But taking part in drills is important, but I guess the visual clues don't always match the drill. The sense of urgency, the sense of purpose, the level of anxiety don't always match up, but they're better than nothing. So, participate in drills is important. And again, a mass casualty incident, anything that overwhelms the local responses. You have 4 people that are critically injured and you got 1 ambulance. You can't load all 4 of them up. What you going to do? So, and making part, what are you going to do when you're the first company on scene? And you're a brand new medic with a brand new basic partner and nobody's got really any experience. And how are you going to figure that out? Hopefully your company has given some insight during the orientation process that what is the expectations and hopefully they've recommended that you've taken some of the NIMS classes, whether it's 100, 200, 7 and 800, especially entry level. Those are all very, very good classes as far as giving you some more information. So being able to act as the incident commander, and again, in the great state of Ohio, the fire chief or his designate is in charge of the incident in the state of Ohio. You get a private ambulance company showing up first. Whoever is, like I mentioned earlier, if it's a double medic car, whoever's turn it is, might be the incident commander at first. Okay, and again, the agencies show up, establishing or passing command. And again, taking this big incident and making it into small workable parts. And that's all the incident command system is. But again, that concept of I am the incident commander really isn't an ego trip. It's holy crap, I'm the incident commander. I got to figure this out. And again, you're going to have people that are going to help you. You may have other resources showing up that you offer to work with them as far as communication and almost like senior advisor staff that help me out here. What am I missing? Let's talk this through. And again, when we have different agencies rolling in, law enforcement, fire, EMS, public works, all those different agencies, that unified command where we may have one person as the incident commander, but everybody's working together to accomplish those goals. And again, it kind of flows really easy that if the fire chief or fire officer tells an EMS crew to do something and it's not from their own organization, it may not go so well. But if the EMS supervisor's at the command post and it's relayed that, hey, I need the EMS crew to do this, and that is given to that crew from their supervisor, the results may be a little bit better. So, establishing command doesn't mean, it just means whoever's going to be in charge of that. But again, it can be very fluid. One of the things that we talk about, as far as mental health resources, psychological first aid for everybody, not only for responders, but for victims as well. Obviously, major life threats are going to wait, but again, we may have a bunch of people that are going to be on scene for a little while that aren't going to die from their injuries, that having somebody there to talk to them, whether it be clergy, or just non-denominational or health service personnel, can go a long way. Okay, and again, doesn't require special training or certification. Basic human needs to sit and talk to somebody, just being there sometimes can help a lot. Being able to listen, convey compassion, assess needs, basic physical needs are met. Not forcing personnel to talk. Again, for us, just being available, knowing they're there. We tend to be very wary of strangers, and especially after the incident starts to wind down, that while we're in the staging area where we still may be needed, but we don't have an assignment yet, having somebody come in, just talking to the crews, checking on their well-being. How you guys doing? Everybody all right? Even little things. You guys need some water? We got a bathroom open up the street or something. All the little pieces of the puzzle. And again, our disaster mental health services, providing or mobilizing a company from family or significant others, encouraging but not forcing social support, protecting from additional harm. Screening both rescuers and victims for signs of and symptoms of associated with traumatic stress. Remain available and work with emergency personnel to identify anyone who may not be recovering normally from the event. So a couple days after, having somebody just touching base, and again, making sure that the demons don't follow us home. We're going to end up at some point in our career doing things that not everybody can do or want to do, seeing things that not everybody should see or have to see, but we're gonna. And it's going to affect everybody in some form or another, whether it is a cumulative effect or an acute effect from it. Sometimes, talking amongst ourselves, peer support goes a long way. Talking to a stranger, sometimes some people feel better about talking to a stranger or talking to, somebody that is trained in that, but, it all depends. But there's a lot of potential from significant events that, unfortunately, some of the leading causes of death in our business are suicides. And again, we need to do better helping each other and protecting each other. But again, it may not be the one event. It could be the cumulative event. It could just be the day. And, we don't really want to lose anybody from something like this. We owe it to each other as professionals to help each other out. All right. So one thing that I'm going to go back into here real quick that I kind of jumped through that I missed, apologize for that, is I want to talk about the START technique, which is rapid triage and or simple triage and rapid transport, getting the right people in the right place. And give me 1 second here that where I thought I was not. I lost my spot that I had the right chapter, but I want to make sure that I had the right category. Here we go.
Got
Okay.
woodpeckers over there.
Again? Okay. So the EMS branch that we start talking about, again, that we get on scene, we make this determination that we need the cavalry. We got a lot of hurt people. We need to figure out what we need to do. And the simple triage and rapid transport is a very quick and effective means of getting people properly sorted based on the resources we have available and getting the right people in the right spot. And one of the things that we look at, we can sort a lot of people very quickly, and it does not require specific diagnosis on the part of the responder. So the big things we're looking at here, the ability to walk, respiratory effort, pulses, and neurologic status. So our first one, again, anybody that can get up and walk, come to me. So as we're walking, we start looking how many people are staying on the ground, how many people are dragging, how many people we look in signs of obvious distress, how many people are leaving a blood trail. We can start addressing from there. And again, any patient that can complete these tasks despite injuries categorized initially as a green. So now we're looking at the folks that are staying on the ground or can't follow the command. If they're laying on the ground and they're not breathing, open the airway manually. Those who start to breathe spontaneously become a priority 1 or red. Those who fail to respond are now priority 0 or black. They're dead. We're not doing anything more for them, unfortunately, especially if we have a large number of people to sort out, that if you are not spontaneously breathing and we open up your airway and you don't take a breath on your own, unfortunately, you are black tagged or priority 0. We are not going to put any more resources for you. Patients with respirations above 30 are tagged red, and then respirations less than 30 go to the next assessment step. So the preferred method of assessing perfusion for quick and dirty is a radial pulse. People that don't have a radial pulse are now reds or priority 1. If the patient has respirations less than 30 and have a radial pulse, they now move to the next step. Ask the patient to grip both your hands. If they can perform this task, categorize as priority 2 or yellow. If they can't do this, they're priority 1 or red. And again, the SALT is the sort assessed life-saving interventions, the treatment, transport, or triage, not age specific. So we sort at global sorting. The still or obvious life threat is a priority 1. Priority 2 is wave or purposeful movement, and 3 is the ability to walk. Step 2, assess the individuals. Red, require immediate life-saving interventions. Delayed, yellow, do not require immediate life-saving interventions, and conditions are likely to deteriorate without medical care. And again, life-saving interventions, tourniquets, seal the box, sucking chest wounds, holes in the chest or the abdomen or the neck. If we can seal them, uncontrolled bleeding from the extremities, we tourniquet, and we pack the armpits and the hips, the crevices, the creases there, and kind of go from there. Our minimal green minor injuries, self-limited if not delayed. Again, isolated extremity fractures, things like that. Expectant, immediate injuries felt to be incompatible with life. Again, they start, are they still breathing, but what's going on with them? Are they going to survive this event? And again, black, non-breathing after life-saving interventions, which opening the airway. Again, the dynamic, the triage assessment can be changed based on changing patient condition, scene resources, scene safety, treatment, transport, immediate, delayed, minimal, and expectant. And again, you think about a couple things here. Always think back World War II, Pearl Harbor, when they had all the horribly burned military personnel that most of them were listed as expectant. That they were just completely overwhelmed. They didn't have the treatment for the burn injuries. There wasn't enough medication for pain management, and their injuries were just incompatible with life, and they were expectant. They were keep them comfortable, keep them calm, talk to them, hold their hand, talk to them, and they were lucky to survive, hours or whatever. They just weren't going to survive the event. So part of what happens, and again, I believe today it popped up as a memory in Los Angeles that there was a driver who decided to commit suicide by train and pulled in front of a metro train in Los Angeles, and a large number of people were killed. There was a large number that had significant life injuries. And the thing I remember about that incident was when they set up the treatment areas. And again, the folks that they moved to the priority area, primary treatment area, and then the yellow, the number 2 priority area, and then the green area. That one of the things that changed with it was that one of the train engines started leaking diesel fuel. And so they actually had to move treatment areas because the area that they were treating the folks in became contaminated. So not only was it a mass casualty incident, but again, that expectation of things going wrong where they actually had to move treatment areas because the treatment area was contaminated with diesel fuel. And again, what can go wrong will go wrong. So it's something to keep in mind as well. That trying to get, we don't want to over triage, we don't want to under triage, but we want to get the right resources. And again, a mass casualty incident, if you're one of the transporting ambulances, you might only really have the patient's name. We're not going to go through our regular routine upon arrival at the hospital where we register the patient and things like that. It's going to be a very quick turnaround that you drop the patient off, give them the vital signs of treatment that you performed, and then you're returning to the incident, going back to the staging area to get another assignment possibly. So it's going to be a lot different than anything that we normally deal with. Now, another tool that we look at dealing with pediatrics, again, the Jumpstart Pediatric MCI triage tool, an objective tool developed for the triage in children in a mass casualty setting, and it's parallel to the START system, but it designs to optimize the primary triage of injured children, enhances the effectiveness of the right resources, and reduces the emotional burden on triage personnel making those tough decisions. And again, the framework helps ensure injured children are tagged by responders using their heads instead of their hearts. And it recognizes the difference between adult and pediatric physiology and the appropriate physiologic parameters. So we look at our triage and tagging and our labeling, which alerts providers to the specific priorities, prevents re-triage of the same patient, and the tracking system during transport and treatment. And again, we do, we talk about triaging. I mentioned the red, green, and yellow and black, that we do have mass casualty kits, or we should, at least access to them on our vehicles so we can start triaging people. So again, that tracking system, whether we're doing the jump start or the start or whatever. And again, we can have our commercial tags. Can use surveyor's tape. Again, you go to a hardware store and get that. Easy to use, the rapid visual priorities. And unfortunately, we're not going to do that one-on-one patient care kind of thing. Simple care, opening airways, direct pressure, tourniquets can save lives early on in an incident. The equipment that we're using is going to be minimal at best. Having tape tags, radio, vests and flashlights, especially if it's dark. Being able to take less than 30 seconds to triage your patient. And personnel often assist triage officers with large number of patients. And you can be assigned individually or in units, but again, you're still being assigned that task. And if we're doing an assignment where we haven't been assigned, we're freelancing. Freelancing can slow down the operation. So you want to work in that command system that when you're dispatched to the incident, you're assigned to the staging area, the staging officer gives the assignment based on what the incident commander has requested. You may be assigned to part of a branch to now further triage the patient and go from there. Again, the morgue areas, the black, and again, black with the mass casualty is it's going to be a crime scene. So we may need to, that may be delayed moving people until all the law enforcement type investigations are completed. But we may need a place where we're going to have to put the bodies, and we may need large numbers, depending on the incident, of some type of morgue facility to help preserve the bodies as well for the autopsies. And again, the morgue officer reports to the triage officer, treatment officers. And again, hopefully we have a plan in place for large numbers of fatalities. And again, we may need counselors and clergy and things like that, especially with a large number of dead. And again, our treatment, large numbers of patients that exceed the ambulance. Like I said, rule of thumb used to be no more than 10 ambulances. And then we have our treatment sector supervisors, make sure that everything's going as it should in their treatment areas. And then a secondary triage to make sure that the patient's condition hasn't changed. And again, what maybe thought originally was a red is now a maybe down to a yellow, or has maybe the priority patient, because we didn't have enough resources available, they will now, they may have died. So now they are priority 0, they're black tagged, and they're moved away. So those things happen. Again, a blast from the past for some of the folks in the area from a mass casualty drill. They recognize that very young man right there. So again, patients separated into functional treatment areas, having some of the basic equipment there, airway maintenance, oxygen, bleeding control, burn management stuff, transportation devices. I had the wonderful opportunity a few years ago to New York City, to their training facility. And they were talking about, if anybody remembers the Mumbai incident that happened, I want to say 2009, 2010, where it was an active shooter in multiple buildings throughout the city. There were fires, there were, like I said, running gun battles. And New York City was obviously very interested in, especially after September 11th and things of that nature, and one of the things they looked at was utilizing transportation devices and how do we move people everywhere. And New York City's solution was engine companies. Now, their engine companies may have first responders on them, but what they were looking for was using engine companies as stretcher bearers. So again, we may be looking at trying to get ambulances, but we may need to also look at having fire resources, not for assist with EMS per se, but we may need litter bearers, and having even service organizations, if we can access enough people in a timely manner to get people to help carry stretchers, can go a long way to assist getting our patients loaded. So again, our red treatment area, critical patients, the bulk of our medical resources are going to go to red. Supply system necessary to support this. On-scene physicians should be used. The the yellows, as far as do not require immediate intervention or transport. They require an IV or a surgical intervention, but you have some time. So in our green, again, our ambulatory patient, prepared for transport, very little care necessary, some long-term stuff. So I'm going to stop right there. We're getting pretty close in the time. I'm kind of running over a little bit. I do want to thank everybody for listening tonight. I hope you got something out of this, as opposed to the ramblings of a guy, talking with you tonight who really enjoyed spending some time with you. But look forward to spending some time with you again down the road sometime. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Captain Opsitnik. While he signs off, Bill Opsitnik was part of the YSU faculty for the EMS program, both at the EMT and paramedic program level. So actually, he was one of my instructors when I went through in 2007. And also this next guy who's coming up, which is Justin Koper. He's the continuous improvement manager for HealthNet Critical Care Team and HealthNet Aeromedical Services that expands from West Virginia all the way to Washington, D.C. Pretty knowledgeable person, has a master's in safety and a flight paramedic. And for the sense of time, we're just going to roll right into him. If you need to take a break, go ahead and do it. But we're going to try to get you out close to time as possible, especially should Mistovich isn't speaking. So, Justin, when you're ready, go ahead and take it over.
All right, Larry, can you see my screen?
I can see and hear you.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks, everybody. I'll try to stay on schedule as best I can tonight. So like Larry said, my name is Justin Koper, and I'm the Continuous Improvement Manager for HealthNet Aeromedical Services. We're an air and ground transport service based out of Charleston, West Virginia. YSU alumni from the 2008 paramedic program, actually with Larry. And for the last 5 years before I came into my current role, I actually was a safety manager for the program. So that's why I'm talking about culture of safety in EMS tonight. So we're going to talk about why we need to change some of our safety behaviors in EMS and kind of why we're talking about culture of safety within the context of a national research curriculum. We're going to define culture of safety, identify some of the elements of these types of programs to make our business a little bit safer for us as clinicians. We're going to talk about a term that some people may have not heard on this, just culture. That's kind of foundational to a lot of this safety culture conversation. And we're going to talk about the importance of reporting near-miss events. So starting off at the very basic level, why are we talking about safety in EMS? Well, we know that there's a risk of harm to us as EMS providers. We know that we sometimes, unfortunately, pose a risk to our patients by some of our actions. And we also have a risk of harm to members of the community. Just like when Captain Opsitnik was talking about responding through the community using lights and sirens, we sometimes pose a risk to those around us. So this one slide here, honestly, could be a half-hour discussion by itself because the risks to us as EMS providers just keep going on and on. But these are some of the big highlights that I wanted to talk about. We are 3 times more likely to be killed on the job than the average American worker. So when we're looking at average OSHA statistics throughout the country, we know that our fatality rate on the job is triple that of the average worker. Our transportation incident rate, so the crashes we're getting into, is 30 times higher than the national average. Right now, one of the big things that we're dealing with is a risk of exposure to COVID-19 and other infectious pathogens. We also have the risk of violence against us as EMS providers. That right now is 22 times higher than the national average. This was also hinted in the last lecture. There's long-term mental health consequences of doing this job. If you do it for any amount of time, some of these things are going to stick with you and either shorten your lifespan in this career or cause you long-term problems. There's also the adverse effects of shift work and sleep deprivation. We go through these jobs on extremely long shifts. We have interruptions in our circadian rhythm due to calls throughout the night, working a 24-hour shift. We have cortisol release from constantly having a sympathetic discharge. So there's some adverse physiologic things that we have to contend with in this job. Now, when we look at what our patients have to go through, we know that the healthcare system, especially in the United States, is not perfect. The first line here is actually a report called To Err is Human. This came out in 1999. This was an Institute of Medicine report. And they did a study in Colorado and in New York looking at patients that died within their hospital systems due to preventable medical harm. And that could have been due to medication errors, could have been due to a delay in diagnosis or an incorrect diagnosis, medical equipment failure, essentially anything that went adverse throughout their course of care. They took those numbers and extrapolated them out to kind of get an estimate of what they thought the problem of preventable medical harm was in the United States. And they estimated that 98,000 people die every single year in hospitals only. So this is just an in-hospital number due to preventable medical harm. They've tried to replicate this study numerous times since then. The most recent was 2013, and there's a lot of controversy with how they got to that number. But the numbers range on the low end from 20,000 patients a year nowadays, on the high end up to 250,000 patients. The moral of the story is it's not zero. So we know we as healthcare providers are responsible to harm to our patients. And so we really have to adapt our practice to make this as safe as possible for the patients that trust us to care for them. One of our biggest struggles of EMS that the hospitals have a really big advantage at right now are health data exchanges. So if we have a patient show up at a hospital and they've never been there before, and all of these different hospital systems have electronic charting, there's a high probability that they're going to be able to get those patients' health records in a relatively short time frame to inform their clinical decision making. We as EMS really don't have that. So we're operating with a really limited set of information when we're on scene with these patients, especially if the patient's altered or unresponsive. We're operating off of a lot of situational cues. You know, what's around the patient? What's in their refrigerator? Do we see a vial of insulin in there? Where's the pill bottles? And we start doing pill counts. So we're really kind of detective on these scenes. And if we're not picking up some of those situational cues, we might miss out on a key piece of information. We have limited diagnostic assessment tools. I kind of get spoiled on the aircraft where I have ultrasound, pre-hospital lab equipment, all of these other things. We don't have that in the back of an ambulance. So we really don't have the fancy tools to facilitate decision making. We have limited to no medication verification technology. So if you are an inpatient in a hospital and you're going to get a medication, the nurse is going to scan your wristband and they're going to scan the barcode on the medication vial to make sure that that matches the order set in the computer. We're reaching into a medication bag at 3 in the morning in a dark room and trying our best to make sure that we're reading the vial correctly, remembering the right concentration. And that's especially problematic right now with the way medication shortages are. We're getting medications in different concentrations. So it might not be a concentration we're used to, and that predisposes us to making a medication error. Similarly, when we're operating in the back of the ambulance, chances are we're single provider. So we don't have somebody back there to bounce ideas off of, to help verify medication doses, to help with airway procedures or anything like that. Another big source of patient harm comes from handling patients. No matter what we do on a call, if we're going to transport a patient, we're going to be moving them on and off a stretcher, on and off a stair chair, up and down steps, in and out of an ambulance, and those are all potential sources of patient harm. And then the next thing is airway management. That's kind of a big point of discussion right now nationally. The National Association of EMS Physicians just came out with a document called the Compendium on Airway Management Position Papers, and it's about 140 some pages of peer-reviewed research on the best way to manage airways in the pre-hospital environment. So there's a lot of discussion nationally right now about that. And like I mentioned earlier, the community risks to the community. When we're responding through a community, we really have to be a steward of everybody's safety around us. We do know with lights and sirens, that's kind of a big dogma of EMS in the majority of situations. We do know that there's really no measurable benefit in the majority of cases. The majority of the time that people are calling 911, it is not a true emergency. We know that, the hospitals know that. They're lay providers, they're lay people, they don't know what constitutes a true emergency. I mean, I know personally I've gotten 911 calls for a prescription refill. So there's really no benefit to us, the patient, or the community to respond to those calls with lights and sirens. We also know that there's a limited benefit with lights and sirens to patient outcome in select cases, like Larry mentioned, with severe trauma, with STEMIs, with strokes, and especially with initial response to non-traumatic cardiac arrest. We do know that there is a measurable benefit there. So with all that said, we've kind of covered the risks to us, the risks to our patient, and the risks to the community. And that's really not a surprise to anybody that's on this refresher. If you've been in this business for any amount of time, you're like, well, those are all obvious things. We all know that. But yet again, here's our industry, and we just keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, which kind of meets the definition of insanity, which is why we're talking about culture of safety. So before we go much farther, we really have to define what culture of safety means. And what it means is it's an enduring value and priority placed on worker and public safety by everyone in every group at every level of an organization. So this includes our agency's leadership and us as frontline clinicians. It refers to the extent to which individuals and groups will commit to personal responsibility for safety, act to preserve, enhance, and communicate safety concerns, strive to actively learn, adapt, and modify both individual and organizational behavior based on lessons learned from mistakes, and be rewarded in a manner consistent with these values. So that's a really dense definition of it, but essentially it boils down to two things. Our organizations and our EMS agencies need to be held accountable to provide a safe working environment for us, in an environment in which we feel empowered as EMS clinicians to speak up and say, hey, I'm recognizing that this could be a potential source of harm to me, to my partner, to my patient, or the community. And also, we need to hold them accountable that if I make a mistake, I can come forward and say, hey, I made a mistake. We need to learn from this. On the flip side of that, there's a lot of personal responsibility for us as clinicians to report those near misses, to report mistakes, to recognize that there are ways we can do this job safer. So with that said, we kind of get to this whole graphic here, and this is something that I've experienced throughout my time in EMS. If I asked everybody on this call to raise their hand if they want the industry to change, everybody's going to raise their hand. We all recognize that we as an industry can do better for us and our patients. But when it comes time to actually changing our individual behaviors, we're really set in our ways, and nobody really wants to change their individual actions on the job to really model some of these safe behaviors in a good culture. So we get stuck with this whole vicious cycle here of the same old thinking, which means we're going to have the same old results. And the other thing that is a problem with culture change is it's not a quick process, and people get really discouraged when they say, okay, I'm going to start acting in a safe manner, and they do it for a few months and they don't see any measurable change in their work environment. Culture change is like trying to turn this ship right here with a 2x4. You'll get there eventually, but it's going to take years to turn around the culture of an industry that's been the same way for a number of decades. So there is a document out there called Strategy for a National EMS Culture of Safety. This actually came out in 2013. This was put out by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Department of Transportation, pretty much everybody at the federal level. And this set forth kind of the mission that we know EMS is inherently unsafe and we need to do something different in the business to make it safer. And they set forth these like 6 different pillars that we really need to look into as an industry and adapt these into our practice. And they're just culture, coordinated support and resources, EMS safety data systems, education initiatives, safety standards, and certain requirements for reporting and investigation. And we'll go through each of these. The first thing is just culture. And like I mentioned earlier, this is ultimately the foundation on which everything else is built. Just culture is essentially a line in the sand that separates acceptable from unacceptable behavior. And what just culture is really trying to get to is a culture in which you as a clinician feel empowered to speak up regardless of the outcome and say, hey, I screwed up or something bad happened and we need to look at this. And the foundation of just culture is we avoid punishing human error. Think back to that Institute of Medicine report that I mentioned. The title of it is called To Err is Human. And that's kind of a really profound statement. We know humans are going to make mistakes. So if we design a horrible system for a human to operate in, then we're predisposing them to making that error. So ultimately, the goal of just culture is not to punish the human for making a careless mistake. It's to fix the system that allowed them to make that error. And that's a really different mindset for ground EMS. This is something we've used in the aviation side in the 10 years I've been with my company, but it's really trying to catch on in ground EMS, and it's been a struggle. Because right now, the majority of ground EMS programs have these punitive systems that punish human error, and all that does is encourage people to hide their mistakes as best they can. And with just culture, we really have 3 core duties to perform every single day. We have a duty to act, a duty to follow a procedural rule, and a duty to avoid causing an unjustifiable risk. So these are all pretty simple things. Rules are written for a reason. If there's a rule on how to start an IV, that's probably the best practice to do it. An example of, of following a procedural rule is if we think back to paramedic school, we were all taught when you start an IV, you place your alcohol prep at the puncture site and you work outwards in concentric circles. But the first time we got on an ambulance as a paramedic after we graduated paramedic school, there we were just rubbing back and forth and called it good. So there was a little bit of complacency there, and we breached that duty to follow a procedural rule. And based on our behavior, we can categorize it into 3 broad classes. There's human error, which is essentially a blameless error. We didn't mean to make a mistake. We followed all of our procedures. Really, the system is the one at fault. Then there's at-risk behavior, which is kind of our IV story there. So we know what we're supposed to do. We were just a little bit complacent. We didn't mean to cause any harm, and that's a different category. And then there's reckless behavior. I knew the rule, I knew the risks, I didn't care if it harmed a patient, and so that's kind of the most severe category under this just culture matrix. And ultimately, with just culture, we want to console human error. That's not to say that it's completely blameless and we're not going to do anything to the person. But if I have somebody who doesn't have a policy on how to perform in a certain manner, did what they thought was best, and there really wasn't a structural guidance for them to follow, that's the system's fault. So we're going to console them, but ultimately we're going to try to educate them on how to handle that in the future should they see that situation again. The next thing is we coach at-risk behavior. So we need to get that behavior back on track. So if we have somebody get phlebitis because they got a infection from a puncture site for an IV we started and we didn't follow the proper IV procedure, we need to coach that individual on the proper procedure and kind of get them back on track. Reckless behavior, that's where the punishment comes into place. And the one thing about just culture is we make these decisions independent of the outcome. So if the patient never got hurt, we're going to make the same decision as if the patient died, because ultimately we're trying to fix the process. We're not trying to fix the outcome. The next thing are coordinated support and resources. In the upper left here, we have a lot of organizations in the fire service that provide some resources for firefighters and suppression-based organizations. We have organizations like NFPA, International Association of Fire Chiefs, the IAFF, VFIS, National Volunteer Fire Council, U.S. Fire Administration. For EMS, we do have a few, but they're kind of fractured. We have the National Association of EMTs, NHTSA, CAS, which is a ground accreditation organization, CAMES, which is a ground and air accreditation organization. We have ACEP, which also focuses on EMS, National Association of State EMS Officials, the National Association of EMS Physicians. So there are organizations out there, but each one's kind of putting out parallel guidance. When the federal government put out this strategy for a culture of safety in EMS, they envisioned the creation of an EMS safety resource center that's kind of our one-stop shop for recommendations on how to perform in the EMS industry in a safer manner. They envisioned it to function much like the NTSB does for the FAA. And for those of you not familiar, the National Transportation Safety Board investigates adverse events, helicopter crashes, airplane crashes, boat crashes, you name it. And they offer recommendations, especially in aviation, to the FAA to say, we examined this incident. We think these are the regulations that should be put in place to increase the margin of safety and make sure this doesn't happen again. So mind you, this document came out in 2013, and this EMS Safety Resource Center still has not been created. So our industry is starting to stagnate a little bit and kind of needs that push to get some of these programs put into place. Next core component of this safety culture is understanding our data as an industry. So having a safety data system. The problem is we have national data definitions that are far different. If I were to ask everybody on this call what your definition of an intubation attempt is, I would get some people say it's physically the act of passing a tube. I would have other people say it is inserting a laryngoscope into the mouth. Excuse me. So there's different definitions for something as simple as an intubation, which is done hundreds of thousands of times on an annual basis in the country. So it's really tough to compare systems and kind of benchmark what the best practices are when everybody's defining things a different way. NEMSIS, which is the National EMS Information System, is trying to come out with some standard definitions. They're really working towards that. Some other organizations that are trying to assist with us understanding proper benchmarks and patient safety are patient safety organizations. One example that focuses specifically on EMS is the Center for Patient Safety. And one advantage to these organizations is they really kind of offer some root cause analysis findings when you have a bad incident. So if you have a patient harm incident, like a medication error, you can submit all of that data to a PSO, and they'll help you investigate that type of incident, and they'll really look into what your organizational processes are, were policies followed, what was the provider competency level, and they'll offer your organization some guidance on how to improve to make sure this doesn't happen. And thankfully, through the Patient Safety and Quality Improvement Act, that's all protected from litigation. And that's been one of the biggest fears in EMS for reporting patient harm incidents, is we're all afraid we're going to get sued. Well, if you are participating in a PSO, that's all classified as patient safety work products, and that's all protected from litigation. Now, your chart could be subpoenaed, but anything that comes to and from that PSO is protected from discovery. Next part is education initiatives. Ultimately, we want to build clinical judgment. We want our providers to not be cookbook medics. We've always criticized that as an industry. We're trying to get away from providers going to their protocol book and say, well, I see A, and I'm going to do B, and I'm going to look for C. We want providers to think from the whole clinical picture with that patient, so that way they can have that higher level of thinking and kind of understand what their goal is. We also have a responsibility for transitioning new employees. Our agency has had a massive turnover at frontline clinicians, just like every other agency has in the last few years related to COVID. So we really have a big responsibility to make sure the new employees that are coming in the door understand how to do things. What are the policies? What are the procedures? What are the protocols? How are they supposed to operate? And ultimately, with all that said, we want to integrate safety into our daily operations. My goal as a safety manager when I was in that position was not to make safety something extra we have to do. We just wanted to make safety kind of that core function of how we operate. And it required a different mindset. And the last thing is leadership training. If everybody in the organization says from the front line aspect, we're going to operate in a safe manner, but it's not supported by the leadership of the organization, it's all going to fall apart. So leaders need to be trained why safety is important. And they have to understand that some of these decisions aren't going to be popular. Telling a hospital, no, we don't need to take that psych patient on a 2-hour transport in the middle of the blizzard that's been in your ER for 96 hours is not a popular thing for the hospitals to hear. They're going to call, they're going to complain, they're going to call other agencies, but ultimately we sleep safe at night knowing that we kept our crew safe and kept them out of a situation that they didn't need to be in. Next core component are safety standards. And that's kind of a controversial thing when we look at some of these standards that are being developed nationally. But we have to recognize that just like Larry has mentioned and Matt has mentioned with the Trumbull regional protocols that they're updating right now, those have all been evidence-based approaches. They're looking at what the best clinical evidence for something out there is, and that's the way we need to be doing it. And operationally, we should be no different. Right now, they are looking at shifts and fatigue at a national level because we know that we're killing a lot of perfectly good EMS clinicians because they're simply falling asleep at the wheel. And COVID's made it worse with short staffing and extended shifts. Whenever this comes up nationally, and I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation in 2014 when this talk kind of originated, everybody lost their mind saying they're going to take 24-hour shifts away from us. They're going to make us all go to 8-hour shifts. And that's not the desire of the federal government. But what they don't want is they don't want EMS agencies allowing people to work 96 hours straight in a busy EMS agency because we know they're going to have a bad outcome. And the other problem with our industry when we look at national standards is EMS is far different in Montana than it is in New York City. So it's really tough to have one set standard at the national level, but this is something that they're researching. Violence against responders, there is actually federal legislation pending right now through OSHA to force them to create a federal workplace safety standard related to violence against healthcare workers. So you're probably going to see more about that. Transportation safety, Captain Opsitnik mentioned this in his ambulance safety record. If agencies aren't pulling driving records on new hire employees, they're really setting themselves up for failure. We've had people apply with our organization that had no clue their license was suspended until we did their initial background check with their application. And their background check came back and it said their driver's license is suspended. And that was the easiest phone call. No, you can't work here yet. Ambulance design. Right now, the national ambulance designers like Horton, Medics, Braun, they're all looking at what European EMS agencies are doing. Our ambulance design here in the US has lagged behind the rest of the world. It really wasn't evidence-based. And that's why you saw a change in the mounting system for COTS in 2016. The previous mounting system was not based on any crash test standard or proper design. It was just the thing that held the stretcher to the floor, unless you were in anything greater than a 15-mile-an-hour crash, at which point it came out. So the new COT mounts are designed to withstand a 30G impact. So it's more evidence-based. Safety competencies. So do you have to repeat driving competencies every single year? Do you have to calculate med math? Do you have to verbalize how to verify high-risk medication? These are all safety competencies that should be done on a routine basis. The next thing is actually something that's kind of near and dear to me. Because I was a safety manager in a large organization, we have about 500 people. A defined role for an EMS safety officer, somebody that is going to serve at your agency in the role as a safety expert. So if there's questions, they know who to go to, and you have somebody within your organization looking at safety. And thankfully, with some of the work that our organization has done nationally, I was actually invited to author the NAEMT EMS Safety Officer course. So next month, I'm going to be working with the education staff at NAEMT to start designing a one-day online course to at least start giving the basic fundamental knowledge that somebody wanting to go into a safety officer role would need. The next one is probably the most controversial out of any of the evidence-based approaches, and that's physical fitness. We know that cardiovascular disease is one of the top killers of firefighters, but there's really no specific agency looking at line of duty deaths in EMS, so we can assume that it's up there for us right now. But physical fitness is tough for us as EMS professionals, because when you're working an overnight shift and it's been busy and it's 3 in the morning, there's Taco Bell and Sheets, and those are the only two options. And you don't have any option really for meal prep. So nutrition is one of the things that really adversely impacts physical fitness on the job. And then the last thing are patient safety standards. Ultimately, we get into this job to help people. So if we cause harm to our patient because of a preventable error that we make, we're kind of going against why we got into this business. So you're going to see more coming in the next few years, especially at the national level, for patient safety standards that are evidence-based. And then the last pillar is requirements for reporting and investigation. We all know that clinical documentation is extremely important, especially with the statute of limitations being so long. You want to make sure that your documentation is thorough enough that if anything's called into question in 3 or 4 years or 5 or 6 years, you can clearly remember that call. There's something memorable in your chart to kind of jog your memory. Also with documentation, we want to document our near misses. Ultimately, that's probably not going to go in the patient care record if it was something operationally. So we need to have a place to document safety related concerns. And that's something our organization did online. We have both identifiable safety reporting and anonymous reporting, which is the next block below this. If people don't feel comfortable speaking up, we have to give them the ability to do so anonymously. We also want to share best practices. That was one of the things I enjoyed about safety. There was nothing proprietary about what I did in safety. So much of what we do in EMS is, this is our turf, this is our secret. We can't let the other agency know what we're doing. And that's not the case with safety. If we have a really good practice, we need to be screaming it from the rooftops so all the other EMS agencies can figure it out. And we were always engaged nationally when I was working in the safety department with helping other smaller programs figure out how to adapt some of our safety practices into their program. We all worry about enforcement and sanctions for information that we report. For those of you not familiar, there was a case out of Vanderbilt University a few years ago at their hospital where a nurse gave vecuronium instead of Versed. She confessed to the error. The patient ultimately died as a result of the medication error. But she confessed to it, cooperated fully with the entire investigation. The Tennessee Board of Nursing voted not to take any adverse action against her license, and she was brought up on reckless homicide charges, and she, I believe, is facing some severe jail time. So there is a concern about enforcement and sanctions, and that's going to be something that federally we need to advocate for some level of protection to come forward with these things so we can learn from our mistakes. One good place to go for additional information, because this little 30-minute block about culture of safety is really kind of just a cursory glance at everything. NAEMT offers a one-day course. It offers 8 hours of CAPT approved CE specific to EMS safety, and it talks about culture of safety, crew resource management, vehicle ops, patient safety, kind of all the broad topics that we discussed here. The third edition of that course is coming out soon. I was honored to be actually part of the author group to revise that. But the second edition course is still out there and it's good for 4 years. So to summarize, we all know the culture in EMS needs to change, but that is going to require a lot of individual action on our part as clinicians and kind of holding our organizational leadership accountable to support us to move forward. Just culture is really that foundation on which we build everything else, because if we don't feel empowered to speak up and say, hey, I made a mistake, we're never going to learn from the things that are happening in the field and make ourselves better in the future. And if you're interested in more information on this, please check out NAEMT's EMS safety course, because it's a really great resource for a lot more information. And that is all I had. Are there any questions?
I have a quick question, Justin. That helicopter behind you, is that on the Gully River?
That is the Pillar Rock on Golly. Yep. And that is about the sketchiest landing zone that we've ever been to.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, that is, we had an injured kayaker caught in a netty there in between those rocks, landed right there, hoisted him onto the rocks, and got him off the Golly.
That's pretty crazy. Love it.
Yeah, only in West Virginia. The sign says wild and wonderful.
What was that?
The sign on West Virginia state sign says wild and wonderful, so I'm assuming that was part of that.
That's right. That's a heck of a ride. Hey, I really appreciate you made some really strong points there for the safety and the culture of EMS. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work that goes into it. Thanks so much for spending some time with us, man. Appreciate it.
Yep, not a problem.
No questions for him? Okay, then we're going to move on. This gentleman has spoken with us before. This is Mr. Dan Batsie. He is the Director of Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Injury Prevention for the Vermont Department of Health. I want to see your business card. It's got to be a foot long. That's a heck of a title. But Mr. Batsie is obviously an expert in the state of Vermont on EMS and disaster preparedness. He's going to talk to us about our resources in EMS and the best use of our resources. And looks like he's about ready. So Dan's a really good speaker. We appreciate it. Welcome, Dan. Take it away.
Hey, Dan, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
We do.
Okay, now let's just do this. And are you seeing my slides okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, guys. And Justin, I want to say that was a terrific presentation. I really enjoyed it. You're going to see some very similar themes in my talk tonight. And I'm always happy to follow smart people and steal their information. So I'll be doing just that. Speaking of stealing information, I always start my talks by talking about free open access medical education movement, the notion that we should be helping each other get smarter, the notion that we should be sharing information with one another as a profession, and elevating ourselves in the process. So to that end, if there's anything on this talk tonight that is interesting to you, or in the interest of time, I click too fast for you to read my reference or any of that sort of stuff, all you have to do is give me a quick email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll be glad to share any and all of these materials. And this information will be up at the end of the talk as well. I want to start by talking about Megan. Megan was an 18-year-old high school senior, and her mom was an emergency room nurse. And Megan got up one morning and had a pretty ordinary day planned. In fact, she was about 3 weeks away from graduation. She had planned to get her senior pictures taken that afternoon. Mom worked in the ER and did overnight shifts, and they shared breakfast together that morning. And Mom went to bed and Megan went to school. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Megan's mom got the phone call that no parent ever wants to get. and that is Megan's been in a car accident. Now, there were no drugs involved, and Megan hadn't been drinking. It was just one of those things. It was a head-on collision on a moderate speed highway down in Texas. And Mom got the phone call from one of the state troopers on the scene who happened to be an EMT. And the state trooper said to Mom, you know, listen, your daughter's been in an accident and we're going to take her to the hospital, but she doesn't seem to have any life-threatening injuries. She has, I think, a broken leg, and she may have a head injury, but we're kind of assessing her. So Mom, of course, was in a panic and began the process of rushing to the hospital as the scene unfolded. Now, the original response on that scene was a fire department-based first response crew, which consisted of a paramedic, an EMT, and at the time they actually had a paramedic student on the scene. Because of the mechanism of injury and the proximity to the hospital, they decided to also reach out to air medicine. And at the time, a flight crew arrived, and that flight crew had a flight paramedic who was an experienced flight paramedic, been on the job for more than 5 years, and a flight nurse who had an equal amount of experience as well. Now, it was true that Megan had some injuries. She did have a broken femur, and she also had altered mental status. Now, it's unclear, and the documentation is a little bit disputed in terms of what constituted altered mental status. The flight paramedics documentation noted that her altered mental status was demonstrated by the fact that when they tried to put in a nasopharyngeal airway, Megan reached up and grabbed and tried to pull it out. But there's no documentation of that altered mental status of any significance by the original crew that was there. It's also worth noting that Megan was all of about 120 pounds soaking wet with rocks in her pockets. Now, for some reason that evades comprehension, at least in my decision-making tree, the flight team decided they needed to intubate her. They decided they were going to do a rapid sequence intubation process and transport her to the local trauma center. Now, it's important also to note that Megan had no specific airway compromise noted in any of the documentation, that she had no saturation drops noted in the documentation. And so it's a little unclear exactly what their motivation to do this was, other than maybe just to sedate her for the ride to the hospital. But nonetheless, they went and they began to intubate her. Now, at the time of intubation, she was not on capnography. She was not on even a cardiac monitor, despite the fact that all of those devices were available. Now, shortly after the intubation, and they were still on the scene when they intubated her, of course, Megan's saturation dropped, and the paramedic student on the scene raised concern because he noticed that she was getting abdominal distension after the intubation, and actually asked the flight paramedic, the flight nurse that did the intubation, are you sure the tube is in the right place? Because I'm seeing these signs that are, you know, indicating otherwise. To which the paramedic said, no, that's just a side effect of the medication that we gave her. They didn't check the tube. They didn't put her on capnography, and they didn't do any additional actions to confirm the tube at that point. So they took off with Megan, and of course, a negative outcome began in that process. Soon after they lifted off, Megan went into cardiac arrest, and subsequently, Megan died. Megan died of not the injuries from the accident, because upon autopsy, she didn't even have a head bleed. She had at best what we consider to be a minor concussion. And she did have, like I said, a broken femur, but I don't know about you, but I don't see too many people dying of broken femurs, at least not as an isolated injury. No, Megan died of an esophageal intubation, and these providers were responsible for that situation to happen. Now, that's a challenging situation, right? And a challenging call, and I hope that these circumstances frustrate you and make you think about this sort of thing. And I love doing this talk in front of people because I think this is a wonderful discussion point. And I'd like to think of you all and this group here as our little quality assurance committee, because I want to talk about what happened here with Megan. I want to talk about what the circumstances were that led us to this point. And I'm not here to assign blame, but for the grace of God, that's not me that was that flight paramedic that made this set of circumstances here. But I do want to talk about why they failed. What was the circumstance? And if you're listening at home and you're thinking about this, I want you to think in your own head about what made this process come out to the outcome that it ended in. So that's what I want to explore. Now, some of you heard when I was introduced that I'm the director of the Division of Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Injury Prevention for the Vermont Department of Health. It's a fancy way of saying I'm the EMS director for the state of Vermont. And certainly I can tell you, after doing this job for about 7 years now, that errors happen all the time. In fact, on any given day, there's a file on my desk that has some circumstance that was reported to our office about some provider that's out there, some provider that made a bad decision, made a technical error, or some other cause, right? Now, I'm the first to admit that there are some dumb people out there who shouldn't be doing this job, and they make really bad decisions, and that is certainly true. But when I actually think about my own experience, and when I think about the situations that I've reviewed as the director of EMS, what I find is, yeah, there's a few people out there who are just plain lazy and know better and have all the tools and just decide not to use them. And if you want to make an argument that in this particular case, there was a bit of laziness, I'm not sure I can deny that, right? This crew had capnography. By the way, at the inquest following this situation, it was the flight crew said that the capnography wasn't working, even though that upon their rig check in the morning, they had documented it as an operational device. So I'm not sure there wasn't a little bit of laziness here. They didn't put her on a cardiac monitor until after the cardiac arrest. All of those things may come into play here. I also can tell you that looking at files every day, there's a whole bunch of dumb people out there. And those people are lacking some fundamental piece of information that they need. There's a piece of their training that was missing, and they legitimately didn't know what to do under the circumstances. They didn't know what they're supposed to have happen, and that's the reason the error ended up. But when I think about the totality of these sorts of things, of all of the errors I've seen, that's really not the majority of the people that I see. And yeah, there's a few of those folks out there, but largely everybody else fits into some pattern of errors that I see all the time, that there's some piece of this job that's like a charging elephant, that it doesn't matter how prepared you are, what equipment you have, or how ready you find yourself to be, that it's just going to overwhelm you. These are good people that are well trained and well intended and not lazy, but nonetheless the situation just plain gets away from them. And I think that's what we want to talk about. Now, you might say, Dan, why does that happen? What's the nature of that going on? Well, I'll suggest to you that although we certainly see a lot of those charging elephant moments, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, the vast majority of EMS is not that. And in fact, the vast majority of EMS conditions us to a situation where kind of being mediocre works. You know, the average EMS run is not a car crash on a highway that needs intubation. The average EMS run is taking Mrs. Johnson to the hospital after exacerbated COPD. And, you know, look, if you screw that up totally, no one ever will know. And you kind of just condition yourself into this sort of narrow lane of what you know and what's comfortable and what's practiced, and we kind of get into these good habits and they make us feel good. But the problem is it doesn't always work that way, right? The problem is the moments in EMS that we're facing are not frequently prepared for by this kind of behavior. It's not readied by these easy calls and the low expectations that we have for probably 95, maybe even 99% of the calls that we face. The moments in EMS that define us, the ones that really determine our careers, of the quality of our capabilities, are the ones that are difficult, the ones that challenge us, the ones that put anxiety into the situations and take us off of that lane. These are the moments that actually have consequences. Now, I'm a huge fan of sim labs and scenarios and all that kind of stuff, but I can never replicate the reality of that intubation if there's not going to be any consequences. So maybe that person has done all kinds of intubations. Maybe they go to the OR every year with a surgeon over their shoulder or an anesthesiologist over their shoulder watching. But the moment that intubation is on their shoulder, there's a whole different ballgame out there. And that lane that we operate in so frequently, that lane that we are sort of very comfortable with and very familiar with, all of a sudden we're off that lane and we're into a land that causes all kinds of changes in our body, stress and doubt and anxiety and panic and shame, and all of these things come crashing down on our head in a moment. And what we know is these moments change us, right? They change our capabilities, they change our faculties, they change our cognition, and all of these things manifest in the pattern of errors that we see all the time. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Dad, I've worked in the city for a real long time. I'm a veteran provider, and quite frankly, I do my best work under stress. Well, quite honestly, that's not true. And there's nobody that can say that because of all the research that's ever been done around the clutch performer, the Michael Jordans of the world, the Tom Brady's of the world, the people who have achieved the highest level at the highest stakes. What we know for sure is hardly any of them achieve a better level of performance than they do on an average basis. In 1998, Michael Jordan hit the shot heard around the world, the NBA championship. He hit the game-winning shot. And we all said, okay, he's a clutch performer. He's achieving this high degree of capability under stress. Well, what we know about that game is Jordan didn't have a better game than ordinary. He actually had a worse game than ordinary. The stress of that moment made him a worse player. Now, what Jordan and Brady and Reggie Jackson and people like that were able to do is to suck a little less than everybody else. But the bottom line is that level of competition, that level of stress, that level of anxiety actually degrades performance, and we have to expect that to happen. It's a physiologic concept, by the way. It's not something that we choose or don't choose. It's not something that we really can ever even fully prepare for. It's a natural biological circumstance of that fight or flight response going on in our body. Now, we could spend the whole evening and probably the next 3 classes talking about the effects of stress and, and how it degrades things like complex motor function and fine motor dexterity and perception and vision and all those sorts of things. And if you want a really groundbreaking work on it, this is the book that sort of launched the whole movement. It's called Stress and Human Performance by a guy named Driscoll. And in that, they sort of laid the groundwork for all those things. Of course, we don't have enough time for that. So I really want to talk about the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, not just on our faculties, but mostly on our brain. And in particular, I want to hit on our attention, our situational awareness, and our recall and processing, because I think those are all relevant to the situation we described a little bit earlier. So the central question that I have, and when I hear about situations like that is, look, somebody spoke up. Paramedic students spoke up and said, hey, I think this tube's in the wrong place. Why didn't that flight paramedic listen? Why didn't that flight paramedic hear them? Well, we know that there's a lot of things going on in that situation and a lot of factors that are associated with the challenges that paramedic face. And one of them is associated with a little tiny portion of that brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala does a lot of things for you, but one of the things that it does is help us focus attention. And in these stressful moments, in the moments when we're off that lane and we're in that anxiety-laden, consequence-heavy situations, is we secrete a chemical called protein kinase C. And protein kinase C begins to flood the amygdala and it begins to change how we pay attention. Now, I have a dog named Henry, and he's a good old dog, and he can sit up and shake hands and do all kinds of stuff. But if a squirrel crosses my deck, what happens to Henry's attention span? Boom! He's focused, laser beam on that squirrel. He'll never take his eyes off that squirrel. And it begins to change his brain, right? My house could burn down around Henry, and it wouldn't matter because Henry's only going to focus on that squirrel. When protein kinase C begins to soak into that amygdala, that's exactly what happens to our brain. That's exactly what happens to the paramedic who's focused on that intubation and laser beam focusing on what his brain deems to be the biggest threat. That's the perceptual narrowing or the tunnel vision that we hear about all the time when we talk about this kind of stress physiology. Now, the other chemical that it takes a little longer, but begins to build up is a chemical called cortisol. And cortisol has a much broader spectrum of effects, but it affects the frontal cortex of the brain. And the frontal cortex has a lot of things that we do. It's a procedural part of our brain, but it's also a value and judging part of our brain, and it helps us make decisions in the right way. There's a terrific work on this, in fact, a Nobel Prize winning work on this called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it describes how your brain has, a guy by the name of Daniel Kahneman, describes how you have 2 functional areas of your brain that we use to make decisions. System 1 is snap decisions. What's 1 + 1? 2. right? You don't have to think about it. You just say it. It's the system you use to drive your car. You don't get in your car in the morning and go, now let me think about how to drive today, right? You just do it, right? System 1 is stuff that we use all the time. System 2, on the other hand, requires something called nested context. And nested context means that you've got to go back to some experience that you've had and pull that experience out to be able to judge the answer. So if in contrast to 1 + 1 = 2, if you ask somebody what 14 + 17 is, what you'll see them do is pause, and in most people, you'll see their eyes go up and to the left, and they're going to draw from some experience they've had. Now, might be 4th grade arithmetic class, and they're carrying the 1, and they're doing all those things, but they've got to engage a different part of their brain. Now, what Kahneman will posit is that cortisol changes those systems, and it changes how we process information. It takes system 1 processes and turns them into system 2 processes. A great example of that is field goal kickers, right? Kicking a field goal when you're a professional field goal kicker is a system 1 thing. You get out there and you kick it. And if you give that guy a bag full of 100 footballs, he's going to kick 99 of them through the uprights. But if you put that same guy at the end of the game, and the game is on the line, and you put consequence and stress on his shoulders, all of a sudden that cortisol begins to flood that prefrontal cortex. And what used to be a simple procedure all of a sudden changes to something that's not simple anymore. And he's now thinking about the hold, and he's thinking about the laces and the placement, and boink, now all of a sudden that ball's missing the uprights. Happens all the time. And by the way, it happens in our world as well. I'm not going to show you the whole video here, but this is a paramedic student who's graduated from this program. He's intubated this mannequin literally dozens of times and demonstrated competency on the mannequin. Now, the only thing that we've done differently here is taken the head off the stand and placed it on this guy in the back of an ambulance to simulate a call. And of course, now there's like 3 people recording him on iPhones. So he's a little bit nervous under the circumstances because all his friends are watching and we're all sort of seeing his performance. So even though that he has intubated this mannequin literally dozens of times, he cannot intubate under these circumstances. We haven't changed anything. It's the same tools, the same mannequin. He's talking in the video about how he needs a longer stylet. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've never really seen different lengths of stylet. Even though he's used that stylet a million times, he's thinking it's something different. That's the effects of that stress. It's the effects of system 1 now becoming system 2. Now, the other thing that cortisol does is it begins to change our ability to cognitively judge situations. There's a concept called cognitive load that was brought up by a guy named Sweller in the early 90s. And the idea of cognitive load is sort of like bandwidth on your computer. We only have so much information we can process at any one given time. The human brain is ideally suited to process somewhere between 5 and 7 things in a given moment. That's why phone numbers are 7 digits. If they were 9 digits, no one would ever remember them. What we know about cortisol is it begins to change cognitive load. It actually shrinks cognitive load. It reduces the amount of information that we can see. If you want a good example of this, you can watch this video. You can find it on YouTube, and again, I'll share it with you. But it's a little exercise in counting how many times the players pass the ball. Now, if you're watching carefully, you'll note that they passed the ball 16 times. But here's the other thing. If you saw the gorilla, you're only about 40th percentile. You're about 60% of the people who watch this video don't see the gorilla, and it's because they're focusing on the passing of the ball. Now, if you didn't see the gorilla, watch it again, and you'll see that there's a gorilla that comes out in the middle and beats his chest. Now, if you did see the gorilla, and you're thinking yourself a real hotshot now, what you probably didn't notice is the curtains behind them changed color 4 times. Right? So the point is, and the point of this little exercise, and you can, again, try it with your friends at the bar later, is to demonstrate that even here, with no stress at all, with a full cognitive load, there's a lot of things that we miss. So when I think about why that paramedic didn't listen, I think all of those things have to come into play. Was her attention focused in the appropriate place? Was she capable with the perceptual narrowing and the tunnel vision of actually hearing that paramedic student say those words? Was there so much on her brain with cognitive load and the cortisol shrinking the cognitive load? Could she even conceptualize that? Could she even process it in that moment? Was her attention span focused in a different way? Was any of those things in play here? Was that the reason that paramedic missed that call? Was that the reason that they never looked? I don't know, right? And I think we could think about that here for a long time, but there's a lot more going on, right? There's even more elements these moments bring out in us that we have to be aware of. I'm not here to pick on air rescue people, especially since our last presenter was an air rescue person. I admire air rescue people. I think they do a good job. But we also know that when we think about air rescue folks, that many of them think of themselves as sort of the pinnacle, the highest level of pre-hospital care. And that's a pretty heavy crown to place on your head. And we know that when we think about ourselves as EMS providers, very often we elevate ourselves in a very unnatural way. And the previous presenter talked about this a little bit, but I think it's really, really important that we think about this. When we get those National Registry certifications and we get our paramedic patches, we think of ourselves as some kind of a superhero, like we have special powers. And over the years of EMS, we've propagated a great deal of mythology about our own capabilities. We all want to think of ourselves as really great providers. We all want to think of ourselves as a terrific person who's there to help. When we describe our organizations, we tend to put ourselves in the same vein as like nuclear regulatory. We tend to put ourselves in the same vein of high risk agencies. We say EMS is a high reliability organization. Our mistakes mean people die, so we can tolerate zero failure. We can't fail ever. And I think that's a really dangerous piece. And the biggest one, the one that makes me craziest, and the one that I think is the biggest lie we tell ourselves, is that only bad EMTs make mistakes. And of course, if you've ever been a paramedic for more than about a minute and a half, or an EMT for more than a minute and a half, you realize that this is, of course, the worst kind of lie we can possibly ever propagate. Because all of us, and myself definitively included in this mix, we've all made mistakes. And that the way we became good providers, good EMTs, good paramedics, was learning from those mistakes. That we all make mistakes. And as long as human beings are going to be in the back of an ambulance, mistakes are going to be made. And what we need to be able to do is understand that they're there, minimize their impact, and learn from them as we go forward. And I wonder, when I think about situations like that one on the Texas highway, does that perception lead to errors? And I think resoundingly yes. This is a terrific book if you like this kind of stuff. It's called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me. And the authors talk a lot about how the human species processes information and makes decisions, and how we process our ability to make errors. And they talk about a concept called cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance is the difference between how we perceive ourselves and the reality of the situation. So I want you to think about that for a second. I want you to think about being an air medical provider called to the scene of the highway. And now you're standing in front of another crew, right? You're the pinnacle of EMS professionalism. You are the most experienced person. You're the person that gets called when everybody else can't handle the situation, right? That's the top of the game. And all of a sudden you're faced with a situation where you just intubated somebody and you might have put it in the wrong place. I think of myself as an incredibly skilled, incredibly professional, lifesaver, superhero EMS provider. But the reality of this situation is telling me, holy crap, I'm not. And that's a really, really heavy load to carry. It leads to an incredible amount of discomfort. It leads to an incredible amount of sort of cognitive processing changes and discomfort in our own self. And what we do as a human species is we look to relieve discomfort. For that air medical provider to acknowledge that paramedic student, essentially what they have to say to themselves is, I'm not as good as I thought I was. Now, that's a really healthy exercise if you're a well-prepared and well-trained paramedic, but not everybody has that capability. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody can fight through that discomfort enough to say, yeah, maybe I made a mistake. And I wonder how much that played into a role. In this situation, and again, I don't want to go into all the whole videos. This is another scenario that we were working on. This gentleman right here is preparing a pressor for a simulated patient. He's preparing a dopamine drip. And in the course of preparing this dopamine drip, one of the preceptors asked him what the dose of dopamine is. And in the course of asking him what the dose of dopamine was, it became very apparent that this paramedic or licensed paramedic didn't know what the dose of dopamine was. And he kind of fumbled and mumbled and fudged around the edges of this dosing here, but never actually could say what the dose was. Now, we kept pressing him because we knew he didn't know. We kept asking him. Now, he had a lot of resources around him. He had a provider that was standing next to him. He had an iPhone in his pocket. We actually even put a protocol book in the kit that he was using. But rather than use any of those things, after being pressed a third time, he simply picked up the bag and said, I'd give him half of this. Now, half of that was a lethal dose of dopamine. He would have killed this patient had that been a real scenario. But rather than admitting he didn't know, rather than choosing to turn to his partner and say, hey, help me out, or look it up on his phone or look it up in the protocol book, he chose to give a lethal dose. And look, I don't blame this guy. He was under a little bit of stress, and I think he made a bad choice in that moment. I don't think he's a bad paramedic. I think we're all experienced this at one level or another. But this is the challenge, right? That's that cognitive dissonance at its worst. That's a person making a choice to kill somebody rather than admit they might be flawed. And, again, I think the higher you go, the more pressure we put on ourselves to feel like we can't ever make that mistake. And of course, that's just not a good way to go about it. And certainly, if you ask me what that paramedic didn't hear the paramedic student, well, maybe they just didn't want to hear that paramedic student in that moment. I don't know. I'm not sure. Now, fundamentally, none of these situations are rare. Fundamentally, we know that we see these patterns emerging all the time. And the files on my desk from, it's certainly not every one that I see is as bad or tragic as the situation I described, but whether it's from driving errors, whether it's from medication errors, these patterns emerge over and over and over again. And I was happy to hear our previous presenter mention this as well, right? 1.5 million medical injuries associated with preventable errors every year, $19.5 billion in adjudications every single year. That's a huge amount of money going out there. So we're not alone in pre-hospital medicine in terms of making these errors. So I think as we look at that landscape, as we think about how to get around this, we got to think about how we improve these situations. What are the things that we can do? Well, we have partners that face similar situations. Aviation in the late 70s began to face these kinds of situations. There were a couple of really significant crashes. The 747 collided with another one. It killed 583 people. Imagine being the pilot of that plane, killed 583 people. That's began to have an enormous amount of pressure. What person is ever going to want to buy an airline ticket to a company that killed 583 people, right? And at the time, they had a very similar mindset with, I'm the pilot. You can't tell me how to do my job. I'm going to make all the decisions. It's a very similar process to how a lot of people operate in EMS. NASA had similar challenges in the circumstances as well, right? An enormous amount of pressure. They're literally landing people on the moon to be able to do their job. And again, any tiny error in a space shuttle explodes on national television. These are high stress, high reliability needs that are, again, maybe not the same as EMS, but certainly mirrored their thing. Now, what they decided to come up with was a concept called cockpit resource management. It's now referred to as crew resource management. But the notion of that is that it takes more than one person. We cannot rely solely upon a single individual to run an entire scene, because that person can't do it alone. And that if we put a team together, we can begin to change the dynamic of how these situations work. We can begin to change the capabilities of that and move from that individual person to a broader capability of the team, and that is ultimately going to work. The basic concept of crew resource management is you can't be trusted alone. You can't do it by yourself. I can't be trusted alone. And the problem is we all think we can. It's been instilled in us from the first days of our EMS education. We think of ourselves as the only competent person in this moment. We think of ourselves as the Superman, the superhero, the superpowered EMS provider, when in fact we're really not in those cases. And by the way, the last slide was a little bit of a joke, but in this particular slide, we actually can demonstrate this in a research-driven way. Yet again, another Nobel Prize winning work that was done by something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect demonstrated that at the time we are least competent, that is, we have the least amount of capability, we tend to have the highest amount of confidence in our own skill. So if you ask somebody whether they're prepared to do this, they go, hell yeah, I am. And you think about how you were when you had a new license, when you first got out of paramedic school, first got out of EMT school. You're ready to wrestle the world. You're ready to take on any challenge in front of you. But it really wasn't until you learned some of these lessons, until you made some of those mistakes, that you began to match your confidence level back to your competence level. And that's what the Dunning-Kruger effect will say. David Page and I we're on an airport shuttle bus, and we were talking about these kinds of things. This is probably about 10 years ago, and we were surrounded by pilots and flight attendants, and we were talking about how the process of EMS testing leads to some of these challenges, and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the pilots leaned over to us and said, "You mean to tell me that you EMS people aren't tested in teams?" And we said, "No, we're tested as one person." This was before the National Registry changed the paramedic exam. "No, we're tested on a singular basis." And literally the whole shuttle bus began laughing at us in that moment, right? Because what aviation did with crew resource managers is to stop saying it's up to one single pilot. It's not on the shoulders of one individual, but these challenges, these emergency procedures, these simulations that they do every single year, they're taken on as a team. But yet in EMS, we don't think that way. At least for historically, we haven't thought that way. We're not ready to take on all of the capabilities of the team. What we're taught to do is be an individual. Now, the good news is that when NASA and when the aviation industry began to look at these problems and look at these challenges, and they began to apply some of the concepts of teamwork and crew resource managers will describe, what they began to see was these remarkable changes and reductions in the rate of accidents and errors. So we know it works. We know it can help us improve. But the difficulty that we have is that that's not where we're from, right? EMS was born out of the fire service, and the fire service was born out of the military service. And if you think about why fire chiefs wear bugles on their lapels and their collars, it has nothing to do with the bugle itself. A bugle was a megaphone that they used to give orders on the fire ground. And so much of what we do in the world of public safety is built upon that sort of top-down leadership. I'll tell you what to do. That's how EMS was born. And if you think about how we train people, we put them in these unique situations. When that flight nurse learned airway management and we tested her, we didn't test her as a team. We didn't say, okay, everybody come in here as a group and let's all contribute to the situation. We said, okay, come into this little room all by yourself and we're going to watch you do this. And if you ask for help or you look at a resource, you fail, right? And we do that for almost every station. Still, in many cases, especially at the EMT level these days, we still do that. We still say, look, I mean, think about the trauma assessment station. This is a station that's designed to test your ability to manage a multi-system trauma patient. And the assumption that we have as you walk into that station is you can't ask for help and you can't use any other resources. Now, what scenario in the real world would you ever want to put a person in charge of a multi-systems trauma patient without any other resources? It's absolutely absurd, and it doesn't represent any of the best practices that we'd want to be applied if we were that trauma patient, right? If that paramedic student says, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable here, I just want to turn to my partner for help and ask him a question, that the proctor is required to say, you fail. you're a failure. You're not a good paramedic because you've asked for help. So we condition ourselves into these situations. We condition ourselves to get this notion that these scenes have to be all up to me. I'm the only one that can make decisions. Well, what we really have to do if we want to get better and prevent some of these errors is to change. We need to get crew resource management into our world. Now, I came from the military. I was a tanker in the Marine Corps. And we used to think of the tank as a crew served vehicle. There were 4 of us in the tank, and not one of us was more important than the other. We all had a particular job that we had to do. And the successful execution of any maneuver in a tank was determined by the ability to work as a team. And I think that's what we have to embrace in the ambulance if we really want to if we really want to promote that culture of safety that our last presenter talked about, right? And there's several layers to this, and I want to touch on a little bit of each one, but it's about leadership, it's about system engineering, and it's about the training that we go through. Now, from a leadership standpoint, we've traditionally held this notion of top-down leadership, this notion of I'm going to tell everybody what to do. But the reality of cognitive load theory tells us that you just can't do that. There's no one person on that scene that can possibly, especially with the effects of protein kinase C and cortisol, there's not one person that can manage all of those situations. It's just too much for all of us. And to think that we can actively tell everybody else what to do in an organized fashion is a recipe for disaster. Now, you can like or hate Bill Belichick. I'm a Patriots fan, so I'm there. But, his motto in the Patriot way has always been to do your job. But the real underlying principle behind the Patriot way is situational preparedness. Bill Belichick is a taskmaster, but more than anything, what he say to his players is, be ready for your situation. Know what you're supposed to do. Rather than a coach, you kind of think of him as a conductor. And by the way, we apply this same sort of theory all over the place. If you look at the most recent advancements in cardiac arrest science and pit crew CPR, that's exactly what we're asking everybody to do. We're not saying that one person can direct that whole scene. We're saying that everybody should be trained in a specific job, know how to do that job, and then the leader can just kind of manage the whole group out there. The leader can make sure that everybody's doing that job. That's how we can take some of that cognitive load and break it up a little bit. That's a principle called shared mental modeling, which means we need to know what the outcome is that we want to get to, but everybody's going to have a little bit of a different job, but everybody has a singular goal in mind. And that's going to allow each of the capabilities and the experience and all that stuff to meld together as a team. Now, you might be saying, Dan, but look, I work on a chase car and I do intercepts. What about volunteers? Well, we can still be able to create shared mental model situations. We can build task cohesion in these moments to be able to say, hey, look, I know that we don't work together all the time, but here's the plan. Here's what we need to do. We can do that by like pre-game huddles. That's the pause right before you go into the house or on the way in the door where you say, hold on a second, guys, let me just talk about, look, we're in cardiac arrest. We got to make sure we have good compression fraction, hands on the chest the whole time. It doesn't have to take a long time, but just make sure that everybody knows what the common goal is. And then sometimes when that situation begins to get out of control, we can just do something called huddles or timeouts where we say, hold on, everybody, stop for just a second, and let's make sure that we're all on the same page. Maybe everybody's kind of going off on their own thing, doing their own lone wolf action. But what we say in that moment is hold it, pause, everybody, pay attention to me for a second. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page. We all have a shared mental model that we're going to be able to focus our attention to. The fact of the matter is we just don't have enough bandwidth to do it any other way. There's no leader that can observe the whole scene and get enough information to process it properly with safety. What we really need to do is exactly the opposite. We need to start offloading some of that bandwidth. In these really complex situations, particularly when we're feeling that anxiety, when we're feeling that stress, what we really need to do is reduce complex to simple. Captain Sully is a great example of this, a case study in this. Certainly when his large aircraft was crash landing into the Hudson River, there were a great many responsibilities that Captain Sully had. There were lights going off and there were people that he had to think about and there were directions. But if you ask Captain Sully what he was thinking about in that moment, the words that were going through his brain over and over again and the mantra that he was chanting to himself is just fly the plane. I know there's a million things that I have to think about, a million responsibilities that I have, but the one thing that I can do right now is just fly the plane. A similar circumstance happened in the Oklahoma City bombing. The original response to the bombing at the Murrah Federal Building was a battalion response. That was 2 fire engines, a fire truck, and a battalion chief. That's, like 20 guys at the most. When they rolled up, they found that the building was in half. Does that fire chief have 1,000 responsibilities in that moment? He sure does. But what he did in that moment, what that first responding battalion chief did, instead of trying to rush in and trying to take on way more than he could do, is he said to the team, hold on, everybody, let's establish a perimeter. Let's hold off until we get more resources, and nobody's going in until we get a better plan in place. And he's credited for saving lives that day simply because he didn't try to take on more than they could do in that moment. One of the great lessons I learned as a paramedic educator a long time ago was to ask this question to my teams. Everybody starts in a scenario thinking, what am I supposed to do? And I heard this in the last presentation, and I really liked it as well. Everybody has a protocol book. Everybody has some kind of scheme in their head about what all of the things are that they're supposed to do. What we started asking our paramedic students, instead of that question, what are you supposed to do? What does the protocol tell you? What we started asking is, what are you trying to accomplish? What is the goal that you have here? Because it made them shift their brain away from an algorithm to what's the outcome that I'm looking for. And that began to help them measure capabilities under the circumstance. Now, more than that, what we need to condition our folks to do is work as a team, right? Instead of being the lone wolf, instead of taking on everything themselves, we've got to condition them to ask for help. When you're feeling unsteady, when you're feeling unsure, when you have a question, when you don't know the dose of dopamine, when you are unsure if that tube is in the right place, it's okay to say, you know what, why don't you check for me? Why don't you get that capnography out? Why don't you listen to that chest and make sure that I'm in the right place, right? That's okay. And that has to be an integral part of EMS. It's okay to communicate in these moments. It's okay to tie together, to tether together resources to make us more powerful than one single person, right? And there's all sorts of resources. Now, it doesn't mean that every decision has to be made by committee. I think there is a time and place for leadership, and that leadership is vitally important. But the fact of the matter is we've got to condition ourselves, whether you're a paramedic student or an experienced provider, to be able to say to anybody, hey, I think there's something wrong here, or stop what you're doing. You're going to kill this young girl. I think that's vital, and I think that's a huge and exceptionally important element of crew resource management. Now, we'll also remember that we've got to defeat some of those effects of stress that we mentioned before. We've got to actually make sure they're actually processing information and have the bandwidth and the cognitive load and the attention span to be able to do it, and that's the notion of closed loop communication. For years, we've been saying when we teach CPR, go get the AED, but when we practically apply that, when you say that to a group of people in a gym, go get the AED, nobody ever does. And even if they did, they wouldn't know where it is. So perhaps instead of that, we've got to start using some of these links like, hey, you with the red shirt on. Yes, okay, you've got me. Okay, now listen to me. I need you to go get the AED. It's right over there, and come back. And do you have that? Okay. The idea of giving in information, waiting for the receiver to acknowledge, and then hearing the confirmation of that acknowledgement, that's an important part of this. And we should be practicing this in our daily routines, in our scenarios, and all of the things that we do. And it does sound a little corny sometimes, but it's really important in these high stress moments. But most importantly, it's time for us to accept the fact that these are just really hard situations, and that we all have shortcomings. Brene Brown is one of my favorites. She's written a couple of really interesting books. This is my favorite of hers. It's a book called Rising Strong. And in the book, she talks about the notion that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to acknowledge that we have shortcomings. It's okay to realize that we can't do it all. We resisted the application of capnography for years in the early 90s. We said, I don't need this. I'm good at this. I can watch the tube go through the cords. I can listen to the chest sound. But it wasn't until the 1991 American Anesthesiology Society, and I may be mistaking the name of the organization, until they wrote their white paper and said all of our people need to use capnography, that they actually solved the problem. Once that piece was employed into the practice of anesthesiologists, they went from esophageal intubations being the leading cause of litigation against their society to it being almost never occurring. this was a game changer, and it was about them acknowledging vulnerability. It was about them saying, yep, we can't do it on our own. We need some technology behind us, and that's so important. And by the way, there's something called cognitive forcing that comes into play here as well, with the notion that, okay, let's acknowledge that we're flawed. Let's acknowledge that stress is going to impact us. Let's acknowledge that our decision making and our cognitive load under stress is difficult. How about, instead of just trying to pretend that it doesn't happen, let's actually begin to employ some resources. This is the Sedgwick County, Kansas medication cross-check. In Sedgwick County, Kansas, they said, we don't want anybody administering medications unless you can cross-check it with somebody else. Every single medication, they're going to take a moment and just say, hey, my partner, hey, let's make sure that there's no contraindications. Let's make sure the dose is correct. And I know it sounds hokey. Our paramedic students were, when we adopted this, we're down to 32 seconds. It took 32 seconds to do this. It's a series of 5 questions that go back and forth. 32 seconds to make sure that medication errors don't happen. Now, whether you adopt this fully or not, but I don't think there's any medication or any scenario where I'm going to be administering medication where I can't pause for 32 seconds to make sure it's right. And certainly with the amount of errors that are happening out there all the time, I think it's worth it. Kansas also adopted the red rule of medication administration, which means if they didn't draw the medication up themselves or witness it being drawn up, they simply do not push it. System engineering to acknowledge the vulnerability of our providers. System engineering to say we have flaws and we have to work together as a team to make sure that they don't. And by the way, that's metacognition. It's the ability to think about our own thinking, to challenge our assumptions, to make sure that we're double checking and cross checking before we do things. How about the notion of simply looking stuff up? Right? If you come to take care of me and I'm a multi-systems trauma patient, I want you to use every resource you got. If you want to bring a computer, if you want to bring a abacus, I don't care what it is, get it right, right? If you have a cell phone in your pocket, look up that drug dose, turn to your partner, ask him what the drug dose is. I don't care, get it right. Have a list, a checklist, a sheet, anything. But let's go ahead and make sure that we're thinking about our own thinking, right? Whether that's from setup and practice, and we need to be able to utilize these devices all the time. It needs to be a routine part of our safety. And our trainings have to embrace that. And as the final element of this, we've got to think about how to make that work. Now, it only works if we're practicing it that way all the time. And far too often, what I see is training that looks like this. That's not an ACLS situation. That's not how it works in real life. Nobody I know collapses on the top of a table. And look at what the crew members are doing. There's one guy that's on the computer checking his email, the person over there just hanging around, right? That's a completely unrealistic situation. It's creating a situation where the real life's version is completely different. So if we really want to make it work, we've got to keep that situation realistic. We got to put those guys on the floor. We got to engage all the people in that moment. We've got to be, instead of having classes that are just big and talking and hanging around, we've got to rotate them around in schedules of scenarios where they're actively participating and engaging and working together as a team. That's how we're going to get better at this stuff. If the person starting the IV is the team leader, what I want to focus on in that scenario is this guy over here, because ultimately he's got responsibilities too. I've got to be evaluating him as a team member because he's got important roles to play. He's got to make sure that he can correct people. He's got to make sure that he can help his other team members out. There's all sorts of elements to think about as we think about how to make teams work better. The bottom line is we need to make sure that those teams are working towards that common outcome, to make sure that they're communicating, to make sure that they're sharing information and working together to make sure that they're preventing each other's errors. And when we do this, when we get to the end of this, what we're doing is essentially inoculating them. We're giving them a vaccine, essentially, against stress. Because if they're prepared, if they have these capabilities, if they have these techniques, that stress is going to be a little less, right? Captain Sully, if you listen to some of the things that he said after the crash landing, he said that I knew for 42 years I've been making small regular deposits in the bank of experience, education, and training. And on January 15th, the balance was sufficient, so I knew I could make a large withdrawal. In other words, when everything was going wrong for Captain Sully, what was going through his brain was, I can do this. And there's a lot of science that's emerging around this notion that if we can teach people, if we can train people in the proper ways, if we can give them the tools to manage these kinds of situations, when they get into this moment, they're going to appraise that situation as I can do it, as opposed to holy crap, I'm in big trouble. And we know that when they make the judgment of holy crap, I'm in big trouble, that's when the stress effects are even more powerful. So by training together as a team, by giving them these tools, what we're imprinting in their brain, what we're inoculating them with is this notion that I can do it. And that's a powerful lesson. All right. So where do we go from here? This is more than an individual commitment, right? It has to be a group commitment. We've got to commit to a group effort. We need to commit to being a team. We need to commit to as a company, and as the former presenter mentioned, it has to be a leadership-driven piece. There's so many elements of this, and it's so vitally important. We need to build those teams before the calls. We need to ingrain this processing in standard operating guidelines and checklists. We need to have expectations of one another, and we need to communicate those expectations properly. There's a lot of problems if we just would disappear, if we would just talk to one another in these situations, if we would just employ these very basic concepts. All right, I know I'm over time, so I'm going to stop there. This is my email address. This is my Twitter handle. I hope this has been helpful. I'm happy to share any and all. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with me tonight.
Wow, Dan, that was a great talk. I mean, that was really well done, man. I really appreciated that. And we got some comments in the chats too, that I think a lot of people feel the same way. Thank you very much.
Happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Does anybody have any questions for Dan? Comments, concerns, anything?
Can you put his email in the chat?
Oh, yeah, sure will.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess no one's got any questions for you, Dan.
We stumped them.
Yep, you gave them all the information they can possibly use.
Dan, I just got to say, I take no offense to the flight paramedic comment. I'm a recovering flight crew member.
Hey, man, I thought your talk was terrific. And like I said before, I was really pleased that we shared a lot of themes, because that's how this works, right? I mean, I was happy to hear that many of my points were reflected in yours. So great work. Thanks very much.
Same to you. Thank you.
And you know what I've noticed a lot throughout this whole thing is kind of, being back here quarterbacking. I love when one person's talk backs up something that somebody said a couple of days ago or something like that. It's really, people wouldn't believe it, but that's not planned. I mean, we're not trying to push an agenda or anything. I think that's awesome that people from different parts of the country and state and everything are really hammering the evidence-based stuff and doing a much better job, I think. Thanks.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dan. It was very informative.
Thank you very much.
What's that?
Hey, Matt.
Was that Dan talking?
Yeah, it's me. I was wondering if we could start doing a countywide
A countywide what?
A countywide doing like what we used to do as far as incident.
Oh, you mean incident command drills and mass casualty drills?
Yes, sir.
Those are on the horizon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't want to do them when it's 12 degrees out.
Me neither.
You could be our decon victim. How about that?
That'll work.
All right, tomorrow morning, be in the ambulance bay. I'll get the hose.
Sure.
You're gonna need a wheelchair too.
Ooh. All right, well, if there's no more questions or anything, thank you so much for everybody spending their time with us tonight. Sorry we went over a little bit, but personally, I think it was worth it. So, have a good night, and we'll see you on Tuesday.